You think your little dog scares me? Get him out of my diner. Officer Derek Malloy slammed a decorated Navy SEAL face first against the counter, snapped the handcuffs on, and laughed. 30 feet away, a bomb was ticking. Nobody listened. Nobody moved. Nobody believed the man in dusty boots and the silent German shepherd frozen beside a gray trash bin, until the robot confirmed what the dog already knew. Subscribe now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Because what Ranger did next didn't just save one diner, it saved everything. Before we dive in, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling us what city you are watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The sun had barely cleared the rooftops of Clearwater, Florida, when Caleb Walker pulled his old black pickup into the cracked asphalt parking lot of Harbor Light Diner. The truck was nothing special. Faded paint the color of midnight that had seen too many winters. One side mirror held on with electrical tape, a crack running diagonal across the lower corner of the windshield. But Caleb had never been a man who cared much for appearances. He cared about function. He cared about reliability. He cared about getting from one point to the next without falling apart. In that way, the truck suited him perfectly. He sat behind the wheel for a moment before cutting the engine. That was a habit from the old days, from 12 years of deployments that took him to places most Americans would never find on a map. Before entering any building, any room, any space, you paused. You breathed. You assessed, you made sure your mind was clear, and your instincts were sharp. Old habits, his therapist had told him with a gentle smile, are not always bad habits. Sometimes they keep you alive. Caleb took one breath, two, then he turned to the back seat. Ranger was already watching him. The German shepherd sat perfectly still, ears forward, dark eyes steady. He was 78 pounds of muscle discipline and loyalty, trained for 4 years by the United States military, before spending another 3 years at Caleb's side through everything a war zone could throw at two living things and still leave them breathing. Ranger had a scar along his left shoulder from a piece of shrapnel he'd taken in Kandahar. Caleb had a matching scar along his ribcage from the same incident. They'd been to the same places, survived the same moments, and come home with the same quiet that men who'd seen too much always carried. "You ready, boy?" Caleb said. Ranger's tail moved once. That was his version of enthusiasm. Caleb opened the truck door and climbed out. His boots hit the pavement with that particular heaviness that came from a man who had learned to move carefully, deliberately, like every step was a decision. He was 38 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a dark beard that hadn't seen a razor in weeks, and eyes the pale, serious gray of a sky before a storm. He was wearing old cargo pants and a plain dark green shirt, nothing to announce him, nothing to advertise what he had been or what he had done. That was how he preferred it. He had spent enough years in the spotlight of danger. Quiet was what he was chasing now. He let Ranger out and clipped the leash, though Ranger didn't need it. The dog walked at his left side with a precision that no amount of civilian dog training could produce. This was not a pet. This was a partner. They walked toward the front entrance of Harbor Light Diner. The place had been there for 30 years, according to the hand-painted sign above the door. It had the particular charm of old Florida diners, the kind that smelled like coffee and bacon and something sweet from the morning. Baking the kind where the same families had eaten breakfast every Saturday for 2 generations, where the booths had seen first dates and marriage proposals and the quiet grief of people saying goodbye. Caleb had driven past it a dozen times on his way to the beach cabin he was renting. Today, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he had decided to stop. He would think about that decision for a long time afterward. He pulled open the glass door and stepped inside. The bell above the door gave a small, cheerful jingle that felt completely at odds with what was about to happen. The diner was maybe half full. A group of older men clustered around the counter, talking about something sports-related, with the comfortable energy of men who had been having the same argument for years. A young mother in a booth near the window was cutting a pancake into small pieces for a little girl who could not have been more than 4 years old. 2 teenage boys sat hunched over their phones in the corner booth. A retired-looking couple read separate sections of the same newspaper in a booth near the back, occasionally reading paragraphs aloud to each other with editorial commentary. Caleb took it all in the way he took everything in, quickly, quietly, completely. He was 3 steps inside when Ranger stopped. Not slowed down, not hesitated, stopped. Completely. Like someone had reached inside the dog's body and turned off the mechanism that made him move. Every muscle locked. His tail dropped to neutral, not wagging, not tucked, just still. His nose lifted just slightly, the nostrils working with an almost mechanical precision, pulling in the air, sorting through it, running it through a detection system built by nature and refined by years of training, more rigorous than most humans would ever experience. Caleb felt it immediately, not through sight, not through sound. He felt it through the leash, through the particular tension that ran from Ranger's collar to his hand like a telegraph wire carrying a single urgent message. He stopped walking. He looked at the barn and the dog was looking at the gray metal trash bin positioned just inside the front entrance to the right of the hostess stand. It was a standard commercial trash bin, the kind you found in 1,000 diners, the kind you walk past without a thought every single day of your life. But Ranger was not walking past it. Ranger was staring at it with an intensity that Caleb recognized immediately, completely, with every cell in his experienced body. This was not curiosity. This was not distraction. This was not a dog being interested in the smell of someone's discarded breakfast. This was a trained alert. Ranger did not bark. He did not growl. He made no sound at all. That was the thing people never understood about military working dogs trained for explosives detection. They didn't bark at bombs. Barking near an IED could trigger the device, could vibrate something loose, could end everything in a fraction of a second. So they trained these dogs to go silent, to sit, to hold, to communicate in the language of absolute stillness, because stillness was the only safe message in that situation. Ranger sat beside the gray trash bin and did not move. And Caleb Walker, 12 years a Navy SEAL, 32 confirmed missions in some of the most dangerous territory in the world, felt the cold certainty of threat recognition settle into his chest like ice water. There was something in that bin. He didn't panic. Panic was a luxury he had trained himself out of years ago. What he felt instead was a sharpening, a clarity that cut through everything else and left only the necessary information standing. Threat detected. Distance to threat, 4 feet. Number of civilians in the immediate area, too many. Required action, clear the building. Required tone calm. The fastest way to cause a stampede was to cause a panic. The fastest way to cause a panic was to announce the word bomb in a crowded room without preparation. He needed to do this carefully. He turned to the nearest staff member, a young woman in a server's apron who was standing behind the hostess counter with a stack of menus. "Excuse me," Caleb said, and his voice was low, controlled, measured. "I need to speak to whoever is in charge right now. It's important." The server, whose name tag said Josie, looked at him with the politely cautious expression of a service industry professional encountering someone slightly outside the norm. She glanced at Ranger, then back at Caleb. "Sir, we do have a policy about animals inside the—" "He's a service dog," Caleb said. "He's a trained military working dog. And I need to speak to your manager right now, please." Something in his tone must have reached her because Josie set the menus down and turned toward the kitchen. Frank, can you come out here?" Caleb kept his eyes moving. He assessed the exits. Front door too close to the trash bin. Rear exit through the kitchen better. Side emergency exit near the restrooms viable. He was already calculating evacuation routes, already mapping the geometry of the room against the geometry of the problem, already doing the things that 12 years had made automatic. He was so focused on the calculation that he didn't notice Frank Willis coming out of the kitchen until the man was already speaking. "What's going on?" Frank Willis was a heavy-set man in his late 50s, with the bearing of someone who had built his business from nothing and was not accustomed to problems he hadn't anticipated. He wore a clean apron over his dress shirt, had silver at his temples, and looked at Caleb with the immediate assessing gaze of a man who had learned to read customers quickly. What he read in Caleb apparently was not what Caleb needed him to read. Frank looked at the beard. He looked at the worn clothes. He looked at the large military dog sitting motionless beside the trash bin, with his eyes fixed on it like he was guarding something, and Frank Willis's expression shifted from inquiry to alarm in a way that completely misread the situation. "Sir," Frank said, his voice dropping into the carefully controlled register of someone dealing with what they believed was a problem's customer. "Is there an issue?" "Yes," Caleb said quietly. "My dog is a trained explosives detection animal. He's giving me a confirmed alert on that trash bin right there. I need to ask you to calmly help me guide your customers toward the rear exit while I'm— Whoa, 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 Frank said, and his voice went up in a way that immediately caught the attention of the nearest customers. What did you just say? I said my dog has detected. Your dog has detected. Frank repeated the words with a tone of disbelief that had an edge of contempt underneath it. He looked at Caleb again more carefully this time, and whatever story he had already written about this man in his head was getting more elaborate and more wrong by the second. Sir, where did you come from? Do you have some kind of ID or something? Are you law enforcement? I'm a former Navy SEAL, Caleb said. This is a military working dog. His name is Ranger. He was trained by the United States Navy for explosive detection. He does not give false alerts. I need you to trust me right now and help me move these people. I'm calling the police, Frank said. That's fine, Caleb said, but while you do that, please help me start moving. I'm calling the police because of you, Frank said, and now he wasn't bothering to keep his voice down. The words landed on the room like stones dropped in still water, and Caleb could feel the ripples, the heads turning, the conversation stopping, the attention pivoting from a dozen different directions toward the two of them standing near the front of the diner. I don't know what your situation is, sir, but I'm not letting you walk in here and start saying things like bump and evacuation and scaring my customers without somebody with a badge present. Mr. Caleb started, Willis, Frank Willis, I own this establishment, and you need to step outside right now. I can't step outside, Caleb said patiently, and I'm asking you not to step outside either. If there is an IED in that trash can, the proper response is to clear the building through the rear exit, maintain a safe distance, and wait for the bomb squad. Moving toward the front exit puts people within the potential blast radius. Frank stared at him. His face had gone through several colors in the last 30 seconds. I'm calling the police, he said again, and this time it was less a statement and more a decision being made out loud, a drawing of lines, a declaration of which side of this he intended to be on. He pulled out his cell phone and walked back toward the counter. Caleb stood where he was. He looked at Ranger. Ranger had not moved. Ranger was still sitting beside the trash bin with that terrible patient stillness, his dark eyes fixed on the metal container, his body communicating in the only language that mattered in this moment. I found something. I am not moving until you deal with it. Caleb looked at the room. He saw the young mother who had stopped cutting the pancake and was watching him with an expression that had shifted from curious to uncertain. He saw the 4-year-old who was watching Ranger with the pure, uncomplicated delight that small children had for dogs. He saw the old men at the counter who were watching with the more complicated attention of men who had opinions about most things and were already forming them. He saw the teenage boys who had put their phones down and were watching with something that wasn't quite fear yet, but was moving in that direction. He made a decision. He spoke clearly, calmly, loud enough for the room to hear, but not loud enough to be shouting in the voice he had used on countless occasions when he needed people to move without panic. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption to your morning. My name is Caleb Walker. I am a former Navy SEAL. The dog beside that trash bin is a trained military explosive detection animal. He is giving a confirmed alert, which means he has detected the chemical signatures associated with explosive materials. I'm asking everyone to please pick up your belongings calmly and make your way toward the rear of the restaurant. There is no need to run. There is no need to panic. Please just— Sir? The voice came from behind him. Sir, I'm going to need you to stop talking. Caleb turned around. Officer Derek Malloy had arrived. He was younger than Caleb by maybe 5 years, with a jaw that looked like it had been designed to support a particular kind of authority and eyes that had the flat, practiced hardness of someone who had learned that looking uncertain was a weakness. He was a big man, not as big as Caleb, but big enough, and he walked into Harbor Light Diner the way he probably walked into most situations, like the outcome was already decided, and his job was just to confirm it. He had his thumbs hooked in his belt. He was not looking at the trash bin. He was not looking at Ranger. He was looking at Caleb. Step away from the animal, Malloy said. Officer, Caleb said, I need you to listen to me very carefully. My dog— I said, step away from the animal and put your hands where I can see them. Caleb took a slow breath. He put his hands up, open-palmed elbows, bent the universal gesture of non-aggression. My name is Caleb Walker. I am a former Navy SEAL, and this is my service dog, Ranger. He is a trained explosive detection animal, and he is giving a confirmed alert on that trash bin behind me. This building needs to be evacuated, and the bomb squad needs to be called immediately. Malloy looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Ranger. Then he looked at the trash bin. Then he looked back at Caleb. And he laughed. It was not a warm laugh. It was not even a dismissive laugh. It was a laugh that contained within it a very specific kind of contempt. The contempt of a man who had decided that the person in front of him was not worth taking seriously and was not afraid to show it. Your service dog, Malloy repeated. What branch? Navy, Caleb said. You got any ID discharge papers? Anything that says you're actually who you say you are? I have a VA card in my wallet. I have documentation for Ranger. But right now, officer, the priority should be... The priority, Malloy said, moving slowly closer in a way that was clearly calculated to establish physical dominance, is that you walked into this man's diner, you scared his customers, you started making threats about bombs, and you're now refusing to comply with a lawful order to step outside. He stopped about 4 feet from Caleb. That's the priority, not your dog. He's not just my dog, Caleb said, and he kept his voice steady through an effort that was considerable because he could feel the wrongness of this moment expanding the way wrongness did, filling the room, infecting the atmosphere. He could see people watching. He could see phones appearing. He could see the young mother gathering her child closer to her body. He could see the old men at the counter leaning in. He is a trained military working dog with confirmed explosive detection capability. His alert posture is a recognized signal. What he is doing right now, officer, is not normal dog behavior. He is not sniffing around. He is not being distracted. He is sitting absolutely still beside that specific container because that is how he was trained to communicate that he has detected a threat. If you have any tactical training at all, any emergency response training, you will recognize what he's doing. Malloy looked at Ranger, and Caleb saw it. Just for a second, just for the briefest flash of a moment, something crossed Malloy's face that might have been uncertainty. Ranger's posture was unusual. Even someone who knew nothing about military working dogs might find that stillness unsettling. There was something in the completeness of the dog's attention, the absolute locked-on quality of his focus, that even an untrained eye might register as different. But the moment passed, and what replaced it was worse. Your dog is sitting there because you told him to, Malloy said. You want to know what I think? I think you came in here wanting attention. I think you've got some kind of situation going on, and I think this is how you're dealing with it. I've seen it before. Veterans having hard times making big scenes trying to feel important again. He paused. I get it. It's got to be tough. But this is not the way. The silence that followed that statement was the kind of silence that has weight. Caleb felt it settle on him. He felt the anger that came with it, hot and sharp and entirely justified, and he made a deliberate, practiced choice to set it aside. He had been in situations where anger was a tool. This was not one of them. Anger here was a liability. Anger here was a distraction from the only thing that mattered, which was the device he believed was sitting in that trash bin. I am not having a hard time, Caleb said very quietly. I am trying to save lives. There is an improvised explosive device in that trash bin. My dog has confirmed it. Every second we stand here arguing is a second we could be using to get these people to safety. Please call the bomb squad. Call your supervisor. Do something, officer, besides standing here humiliating a man who is trying to help you. Something happened then in the room. A shift. Caleb could feel the audience that had gathered around this confrontation begin to change, begin to hold its breath, begin to wonder. The young mother looked at the trash bin, then she looked at Ranger. Then she started to slide out of her booth. Sit down, ma'am, Malloy said, immediately pointing at her without looking away from Caleb. Nobody is going anywhere. There is no bomb. This man is disturbing the peace, and he is about to be removed from the premises. He looked back at Caleb. Last chance. Walk outside with me, no cuffs, no report. We'll talk outside. I'm not moving away from this area, Caleb said. If I move away, people might approach that bin. I am staying here. Malloy's jaw tightened. Then we do it the hard way. He stepped forward. Caleb did not step back. He did not raise his hands in defense. He stood absolutely still because he understood something that Malloy clearly did not. If he resisted even a little, even defensively, It would give Malloy exactly the narrative he was building: the dangerous drifter, the unstable veteran, the man who needed to be controlled. He could not give him that. He had to be something Malloy couldn't use against him. He was still. Malloy grabbed him by the shoulder, turned him roughly toward the counter, and the room erupted in gasps and the sharp click of phone cameras beginning to capture the moment. "You are being detained," Malloy said, "for disorderly conduct and threatening behavior. Do not resist." "I am not resisting," Caleb said, and his voice was still completely level. "I am telling you again, there is an explosive device in that trash bin. You are making a catastrophic error." The handcuffs went on with a ratcheting finality that echoed in the suddenly silent diner. And then from across the room there was a sound, not from Caleb, not from Malloy, from Ranger. Not a bark, not a growl, not any kind of sound that communicated alarm or aggression, just the soft, precise click of his nails on the linoleum floor as he moved. Without his handler, without a command. Moving on his own initiative in the way that military working dogs sometimes did when the situation called for it, when the training and the intelligence and the bond between animal and human converged into a kind of independent action that was both extraordinary and, to anyone who understood what they were watching, completely devastatingly clear. Ranger walked to the trash bin. He sat down beside it. He placed his nose 6 inches from the metal surface, and he held. In 12 years of working alongside military working dogs, Caleb had never seen a Ranger hold an alert position without him present. It wasn't something they had trained for. It was something Ranger had decided in whatever complex and extraordinary way that dogs made decisions to do on his own. The room stared at the dog. "What is that dog doing?" someone said from the counter. "Why is he sitting like that?" said someone else. "He hasn't moved," said the young mother, and her voice had shifted entirely. The uncertainty was gone. What was in its place was something older and more primal, the recognition that the animal in front of her was communicating something real, and that everyone in this room had better start paying attention to it. "Officer?" The voice came from the far corner of the diner, from a booth near the rear that Caleb had clocked when he came in but not focused on, because the man sitting in it had been eating quietly and attracting no attention, which was itself a thing that Caleb should have noticed, because men who attract no attention in rooms full of people are usually men who know exactly how to manage their own presence. Thomas Reed was 71 years old, though he carried it in the way of men who have never quite let themselves go soft. He was lean in the way that discipline makes men lean, with white hair, cut close, and hands that rested on the table with a particular stillness that matched in its way the stillness of the dog across the room. He had a coffee cup in front of him and a plate with the remnants of scrambled eggs, and he was looking at Malloy with an expression that contained beneath its surface calm, something that could cut glass. "Officer," Thomas Reed said again, "I need you to look at that dog." "Sir, please stay in your—" "I am a United States Marine Corps veteran," Thomas said. "I did 2 tours in Vietnam and 1 in Beirut. I have seen military working dogs operate in conditions that would turn your hair white. And that dog right there is in a confirmed explosive alert posture." He paused. "I am telling you this not as a complaint, not as an opinion, not as a request. I am telling you this as a fact. That dog has found something. And if you do not deal with it in the next 60 seconds, whatever happens in this building will be on your hands for the rest of your life." The room had gone completely silent. Malloy stood with his hand on Caleb's shoulder. Caleb could feel the grip shift, something changing in the pressure, something changing in the certainty behind it. He had felt this before in interrogation rooms in places far from Florida, the moment when someone realizes they have made a mistake but haven't yet decided what to do about it. "Thomas," Caleb said quietly, "start moving people toward the back, calmly, through the kitchen, away from the front of the building. Don't run, don't tell them why, just move them." Thomas Reed was already standing up from his booth. He was already moving with a purpose that the room responded to instinctively, the way people responded to men who knew what they were doing in moments when most people did not. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas said, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone who had once given orders in places where giving the wrong orders meant men died. "If everyone would please gather their things and follow me toward the rear exit. Let's all move together, nice and calm. There you go." People moved. Malloy's grip on Caleb's shoulder loosened. "What is—" "Take the handcuffs off," Caleb said. Take them off right now and call your dispatch for a bomb squad response at this location. Do it now. Malloy looked at Ranger. Ranger had not moved. Ranger was sitting beside the gray trash bin with his nose pointed at the metal surface, holding his alert position with the terrifying absolute patience of an animal that had been trained to be more reliable than human intuition. And something in Derek Malloy's face changed. Not dramatically, not with the sudden epiphany of a man who had been wrong and knew it, but with the slow, reluctant, deeply uncomfortable process of a man whose certainty was draining out of him and being replaced by something he didn't want to feel. Fear. Call it in, Caleb said again, quietly, without triumph, without anger. Just the plain, direct request of a man who needed someone to do a specific thing right now. Please. Malloy's hand went to his radio. Outside, through the diner windows, the people who had been guided toward the rear exit were beginning to gather in the parking lot, looking back at the building with faces that said they still weren't sure what was happening, that the certainty of danger hadn't fully reached them yet. The young mother was holding her daughter against her chest with both arms, the child's face pressed into her shoulder, and she was watching the front window of the diner with eyes that had stopped being uncertain and started being terrified. Inside, Caleb Walker stood in handcuffs beside a trash bin in a Florida diner. Beside him, Ranger held his alert. Between them and everything that the next 30 minutes was going to require, there was only the low static of Malloy's radio and the sound of the officer's voice finally beginning to say the words that should have been said the moment he walked through the door. Dispatch, this is Malloy at Harbor Light Diner on Clearwater. I need a bomb squad response. Possible IED. Requesting immediate assistance. The static crackled. The response came back. And somewhere inside the gray trash bin, with its cheerful Harbor Light Diner logo sticker on the side, something with a digital timer continued patiently to count down. Ranger did not move. He had found it. He had told everyone. He had done the only thing he knew how to do in the language the world had given him. The rest was up to the humans. The radio crackled. Dispatch confirmed the call. And for exactly 4 seconds, the Harbor Light Diner was the quietest place in Clearwater, Florida. Then everything accelerated. Malloy stood with the radio still pressed to his lips, and Caleb could see the man's chest rising and falling faster than it should have been, could see the color draining from his face, the way color drained from a man's face when the ground beneath his certainty gave way all at once. Malloy had spent the last 15 minutes being absolutely, completely wrong, and the weight of that wrongness was hitting him now in real time in front of witnesses, in front of cameras, in front of a retired Marine who was currently hurting civilians out the rear of the building with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this kind of thing in places where failure meant body bags. The handcuffs, Caleb said. His voice had not changed. It was still low, still controlled, still completely without the anger that would have been entirely justified in that moment. Take them off, right now. Malloy looked at him. Then he looked at Ranger. Ranger still had not moved. The dog was a fixed point in the room, a compass needle that had found north and refused to be redirected. His entire body oriented toward the gray trash bin with a focus that had stopped being merely unusual and started being impossible to look away from. Malloy reached for his cuff key. The metal released with a click that Caleb felt run up through his wrists and into his shoulders, and he brought his hands forward and rolled his wrists once, twice, not because they hurt, but because it was the physical act of reclaiming himself, reclaiming the moment, stepping back into the role that the situation required. Okay, Caleb said, and now his voice shifted, not louder, but differently, weighted the voice of a man who had just been handed operational authority, whether anyone in the room had formally decided to give it to him or not. Here's what we're going to do. You stay on that radio. You tell dispatch we need the Hillsborough County Bomb Squad, and you tell them we potentially have a live device with an unknown timer. You tell them the building is being evacuated. You tell them to block the street. Can you do that? Malloy nodded. The arrogance was gone. What was left underneath it was not nothing. It was actually something Caleb recognized, something he had seen in young soldiers who had made a mistake under pressure and were now trying to figure out how to function inside the wreckage of their own bad judgment. It was not a comfortable thing to see in a law enforcement officer, but it was workable. Good, Caleb said. Do it now. He turned away from Malloy without waiting for confirmation, because waiting for confirmation was time and time was the only currency that mattered in the next few minutes. Thomas Reed had moved 10 people out through the rear exit already. Caleb could see through the pass-through window into the kitchen that there were still two line cooks standing at the grill, with the blank frozen expressions of people who had heard the word bomb but hadn't yet connected it to any action they should be taking. "Kitchen staff," Caleb said, raising his voice just enough to carry, "out through the back, right now. Leave everything on the stove. Go." One of the cooks, a young man with flour on his apron, looked at Caleb with wide eyes. "Is this real?" "Yes," Caleb said. "Go." They went. He turned back to the main floor. Three people were still in the diner. Josie, the server, was standing behind the counter with her hand pressed flat against the surface like she needed something solid to hold on to. The two teenage boys from the corner booth were still sitting there, both of them now pointing their phones at Ranger, with the particular paralysis of young people who had been raised to record everything and were only now beginning to understand that there were situations in which recording was the wrong choice. "You two," Caleb said, pointing at the teenagers, "I need you to put your phones down and walk to the back of the restaurant right now. Don't stop. Don't look back. Go straight through the kitchen and out the rear door." The taller of the two boys looked at him. "Is there actually a mom?" "Yes," Caleb said. "Walk." They walked. Josie was still at the counter, and Caleb crossed to her quickly. Up close, he could see that her hands were shaking, could see the particular bright-eyed quality of someone fighting their own adrenaline response. She was young, maybe 22, and she was trying very hard not to lose it in front of everyone. "Josie," he said, and he said her name deliberately because names mattered in these moments, because names reminded people that they were real, that the person talking to them saw them as real. "You did everything right. You called your manager. You did your job. Now I need you to do one more thing. Go out the back with the others. Don't use your phone until you're outside and well clear of the building. Can you do that for me?" She looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face was apparently enough, because she nodded once and moved toward the kitchen without another word. The diner was empty, except for Caleb and Malloy and Ranger, and the trash bin. Malloy finished his second radio call and looked at Caleb with an expression that had several complicated things in it at once. "Bomb squad is 12 minutes out," he said. Caleb nodded. 12 minutes. He looked at the trash bin. Ranger had still not moved, not a muscle, not a fraction of an inch. The dog's discipline in that moment was something that would have been breathtaking under other circumstances. Under these circumstances, it was the most important thing in the room. "We need to get outside," Malloy said. "Yes," Caleb said, "but we don't go out the front." "Why not?" "Because the front door is 6 feet from that bin. If this thing has a motion sensor or a proximity trigger, opening that door could set it off." He looked at Malloy steadily. "We go through the kitchen, same as the others." Malloy swallowed. "Right, okay." "Ranger," Caleb said. The dog turned his head, just slightly, just enough to confirm that he was still in contact with his handler, still receiving, still responsive. "Come." Ranger stood. He took 3 steps away from the trash bin, his body still angled toward. It's still broadcasting his alert even as he moved, and then he fell into position at Caleb's left side with the precision of a soldier breaking from post. They moved through the diner, past the empty booths and the abandoned coffee cups and the half-eaten plates, through the kitchen, with its smell of grease and heat and the strange normalcy of food in mid-preparation, and out through the rear exit into the parking lot behind the building. The scene that met them was the particular controlled chaos of an emergency in its early stage, the moment between awareness and response, when everyone knows something is wrong, but the structures for dealing with it haven't fully assembled yet. 23 people, Caleb counted them automatically, were gathered in the rear parking lot in loose clusters. Thomas Reed was moving among them with a calm that functioned like an anchor, talking quietly to the people who were starting to come apart and directing the ones who were still functional. The young mother was sitting on the curb with her daughter in her lap. The little girl, oblivious to everything except the interesting events happening around her, was watching a pigeon walk along the edge of the parking lot with complete absorption. The mother's eyes were closed, and she was breathing carefully the way people breathed when they were trying to remember how. The old men from the counter were standing together in a tight group, talking rapidly in low voices. One of them had his phone out, and Caleb almost said something, then decided against it. The information was going to get out regardless. What mattered was the physical perimeter. "We need everyone to move further back," Caleb said, raising his voice to carry across the parking lot. I need everyone to move to the far end of the lot across the street if possible. The bomb squad is 12 minutes away. Just keep moving back." Thomas was already shepherding people before Caleb finished the sentence. The man moved with that particular economical competence that Caleb associated with people who had been trained for exactly this kind of moment. Not necessarily this specific scenario, but the general category of it: controlled chaos, frightened civilians, the necessity of calm authority to prevent disorder from becoming disaster. Malloy had his radio out again and was talking in rapid clipped sentences to someone Caleb assumed was his supervisor. Caleb could hear pieces of it. Confirmed call, building evacuated, bomb squad en route. He listened with half his attention, and with the other half, he was doing the calculations. 12 minutes, perimeter established. 23 civilians clear of the building, 1 officer on scene, 1 retired SEAL, 1 German Shepherd. He looked down at Ranger. Ranger looked up at him. "Good boy," Caleb said quietly, and he meant it in a way that went beyond the 2 words, in a way that carried everything he would never say out loud about what this dog had just done and what it had cost him to do it, sitting alone beside that bin without his handler, maintaining his alert in a room full of strangers who didn't understand what he was telling them. Ranger pressed his nose briefly against Caleb's hand. Then he sat back and looked at the rear of the diner building with calm, professional attention. They were 3 minutes into the 12-minute wait when the first news van appeared at the end of the street. Caleb saw it and felt something drop in his stomach. He had known it was coming. 4 teenagers with phones in a diner where a man had been handcuffed after claiming there was a bomb that was social media dynamite. That was the kind of thing that went from filming to posting to viral in under 4 minutes in the current world. But seeing the news van made it real in a different way, made the situation public in a way that added new variables, new pressures, new things that could go wrong. "Malloy," he said. The officer turned. "You need to get that van pushed back to the outer perimeter right now, and you need to get the street blocked. If there's a blast, we don't want cameras within 500 feet of this building." Malloy looked at the van, and Caleb watched the officer make a decision. It was a small decision in the scheme of what had already happened, but it mattered because it was the first decision Malloy had made in the last 20 minutes that was actually correct, actually responsive to the reality of the situation, rather than the story he'd been trying to impose on it. "On it," Malloy said, and he moved toward the street with his radio up. Thomas Reed appeared at Caleb's shoulder. The old Marine stood quietly for a moment, looking at the back of the diner. Then he said, "How long has Ranger been trained?" 7 years total, Caleb said. 4 with the military, 3 with me." Thomas was quiet for another moment. "He ever give a false alert?" "No," Caleb said. Thomas nodded slowly. "Didn't think so." He looked at Caleb sideways. "How bad is it, the device, if it goes off?" Caleb considered how much truth to give him and decided to give him all of it because Thomas Reed was a man who had earned the right to unfiltered information. "Depends on the construction, depends on the charge. In a space that size with those walls, if it's packed right." He paused. "Bad." Thomas absorbed this the way old soldiers absorb bad information, without visible reaction, filing it into the part of the mind where you kept things you couldn't change and therefore didn't waste energy on. "Good thing we got them all out." "Yes," Caleb said. "Good thing your dog held." "Yes." Thomas looked at Ranger. Something moved across the old man's face that was part respect and part something harder to name, something that recognized the dog not as an animal, but as a fellow soldier, as a being that had done its duty completely in the most basic possible sense, that had taken the thing it knew how to do and done it without hesitation or complaint or confusion in the moment when it mattered. "Finest kind," Thomas said softly. Caleb said nothing, but something in his chest that had been very tight for the last 20 minutes loosened just slightly. 8 minutes into the wait, the first police cruiser came around the block to establish the perimeter, and then the second and then a third, and the geometry of the situation shifted as more official presence arrived, and the structure of emergency response began to overlay the improvised response that had filled the gap before it. Caleb briefed the new officers in 30 seconds flat. Trained explosive detection dog, confirmed alert, specific location gray trash bin interior, right side of entrance, building evacuated, bin not approached. No additional personnel sent inside. The officers listened. They didn't argue. The handcuffs were not mentioned. The situation had moved well past the conversation about what had happened to them and into the conversation about what was happening now. And Caleb was grateful for that because the conversation about what had happened was one he was going to need to have eventually, and he did not want to have it while there was still a live device in a Florida diner. 11 minutes and 40 seconds after Malloy had made the call, the bomb squad arrived. The truck was distinctive in the way all bomb squad vehicles were distinctive, built for a specific purpose, carrying within it the equipment and expertise of people whose entire professional existence was organized around the possibility of a very particular kind of failure. Captain Alan Harris climbed out of the passenger side with the focused calm of someone who had done this many times and had developed the ability to arrive at a scene and read it within seconds. He crossed to Caleb immediately. Caleb wasn't sure how Harris knew to come to him specifically, but then he looked at Ranger and understood. The dog was sitting at his side, and everything about the dog's posture communicated that this was where the information was. Captain Alan Harris, Hillsborough County Bomb Squad, the man said, extending his hand. You the one who called it in? Caleb Walker. My dog called it in. I just translated. He gave Harris the information in sequence. Detection location, specific container, alert posture, duration of alert. No one had approached the bin. No visible wires or external markings, but he hadn't gotten close enough for a detailed inspection. Harris listened without interrupting. When Caleb finished, Harris looked at Ranger for a long moment. What's his detection range? Harris asked. He's been confirmed on TATP, RD, XA, NFOP, ET, N, and standard black powder, Caleb said. He detected from the doorway, roughly 12 to 15 feet. Harris absorbed this. And the alert posture, passive alert. Full passive hold, Caleb confirmed. Nose to container, zero movement. Harris nodded once. Then he turned back to his team and began issuing instructions in the rapid, precise shorthand of a unit that operated with complete internal coherence. Everyone knowing their role, everyone moving into it without the need for clarification or repetition. The robot came out of the back of the truck, and watching it deploy was watching a machine designed specifically for the gap between human courage and human limitation, a gap that Caleb understood better than most. The robot moved around the building, guided by an operator with a tablet, and the people in the parking lot watched its progress on the operator's screen with the particular silent intensity of people who understand that the next few minutes are going to tell them something fundamental about the day they are living. Caleb watched with them. Ranger sat at his side and watched with him. The robot reached the front entrance. It maneuvered through the door. The feed on the operator's tablet showed the interior of the diner from a low angle. The empty booths, the abandoned coffee cups, the ordinary details of a room that had been vacated in a hurry. The robot moved toward the trash bin. It stopped in front of the container. Its sensors engaged. The operator stared at the tablet. Harris stood behind him, watching the screen. Caleb was 20 feet away and could not see the tablet clearly, but he watched Harris's face instead, because Harris's face was a more reliable screen in that moment. He saw the exact instant that the confirmation came through. Harris's face did not change dramatically. It was a professional face, a face trained to receive bad news without broadcasting it. But something in the set of it shifted. Something in the eyes went from assessment to confirmation, and Harris turned and looked at Caleb across the parking lot with an expression that said, without words, that Ranger had been right. Harris walked over. He stood in front of Caleb, and he said quietly enough that only Caleb and Thomas could hear it. Improvised explosive device, timer-based detonation, cylinder construction looks like it's packed dense. He paused. It's live. We've got a timer running. My team is going to begin neutralization protocol right now. The world had a particular quality in that moment. Not silence exactly, because there was the sound of radios and voices and traffic in the distance, and a bird calling somewhere in the trees at the edge of the parking lot. But something underneath all those sounds was very still, very serious, very much the sound of a thing that had almost been irreversible, becoming through a series of decisions made by a dog and a man that nobody had wanted to believe something that might still be stopped. How long on the timer? Caleb asked. Harris looked at him steadily. Enough if your dog had found it an hour later. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. How long was it in there? Thomas asked. We don't know yet, Harris said, but based on the placement, the construction, He glanced toward the diner. Someone put it there before opening. Early morning, most likely. He looked back at Caleb. This was planned. Someone planned this. The weight of that settled on the parking lot like something physical. Caleb thought about the morning, about driving past Harbor Light Diner a dozen times without stopping, about the particular inexplicable impulse to stop today, about the bell above the door and the smell of coffee and bacon and the way Ranger had stopped 3 steps inside and refused to move, refused to be wrong, refused to let the world's misreading of him change what he knew. He thought about what would have happened if he hadn't stopped, if he had driven on to his quiet beach cabin. If Ranger had never been given the chance to tell anyone what he'd found, he didn't let himself think about it for more than a second. That was another old habit. You didn't live in the alternate version of events. You lived in the one that was happening. The bomb squad worked for 19 minutes. 19 minutes during which the people in the parking lot waited in a particular suspended state, and Malloy stood off to one side with his arms crossed and his face doing something complicated, and Thomas Reed sat on the curb next to the young mother and her daughter and said nothing. Just sat there being the quiet, present, solid weight of someone who had waited out bad minutes before and knew that waiting was its own kind of courage. The little girl at some point during those 19 minutes climbed down from her mother's lap and walked over to Ranger. She was 4 years old and she had no fear of the large German Shepherd because she had not yet learned the particular fear that came from knowing what things could do rather than what they looked like. She walked right up to Ranger and put her small hand on top of his head. Ranger turned to look at her. His tail moved once. The little girl said, "Good doggy." Her mother made a sound that was not quite a word, reaching out with one hand, but not stopping her daughter watching with the complicated expression of a parent who is frightened and grateful and overwhelmed all at once. Caleb looked down at the child and the doll and did not trust himself to speak. Then Harris's voice came across the lot clear and certain. "Device neutralized. Building is clear." The sound that came from the people in that parking lot was not a cheer exactly. It was the sound of air leaving lungs that had been holding it for 19 minutes. The sound of shoulders dropping and hands unclenching, and the particular exhale of people who have just understood what almost happened to them and what didn't. It was a very human sound, raw and unpolished and completely real. Malloy uncrossed his arms. He stood there for a moment, and then he walked toward Caleb, and Caleb watched him come with the level measured attention he gave to all incoming things. Malloy stopped in front of him. His jaw was working, his hands were at his sides. He was a man trying to say something that his entire professional self had been built to never have to say, and it was costing him. He started, stopped, started again. "I made a serious error in judgment today." Caleb waited. "I should have listened," Malloy said. "I should have listened to you when you first told me. I should have listened to you when Thomas told me. I should have listened to what the dog was showing me. Instead, He stopped again. "People could have died because of decisions I made this morning. That's not something I know how to." He shook his head. "No," Caleb said, "it's not." He let that land for a second, not cruelly, but clearly. "But they didn't die. So what you do now is figure out why you made the choices you made and make sure you don't make them again." Malloy nodded. Something about the directness of it seemed to help him, seemed to give him something solid to hold on to in the wreckage of the morning. A police cruiser pulled into the far end of the parking lot, and a man in a command uniform climbed out with the bearing of someone who had heard things on the radio that had brought him to this location personally, and who had several questions, all of them urgent. Caleb recognized the type immediately. This was the person in charge of the person who had failed. Captain Alan Harris moved to intercept him, and they spoke briefly. Harris pointing toward Caleb, toward Malloy, toward the rear of the diner, where the bomb squad was documenting the neutralized device. The man in the command uniform listened with a stillness that was entirely different from Thomas Reed's stillness. Thomas's stillness was the stillness of someone who had made peace with hard things. This man's stillness was the stillness of someone tallying something up. He turned and walked directly toward Caleb Walker. He was Police Chief Robert Gaines, and he introduced himself with a handshake that was firm and serious, and contained within it none of the studied authority of a man performing his rank. He looked at Caleb, and he looked at Ranger, and then he looked at the building, and then he asked Caleb to tell him everything from the beginning. So Caleb did. He told it plainly without embellishment, without the anger that would have been completely justified without the need to make himself the hero of his own account. He told it the way he would have given an after-action report, which in a sense was exactly what it was. Threat detected, warning given, warning ignored, escalation, restraint applied, civilian intervention by a veteran who recognized the alert posture, evacuation accomplished, bomb squad called, device found, device neutralized. Chief Gaines listened to all of it. When Caleb finished, Gaines was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want you to know that what you did today and what your dog did today saved lives. That is not something I say lightly, and it is not something this department will ignore." "I appreciate that," Caleb said. Gaines looked at Malloy, who was standing 15 feet away. Something moved through the chief's expression that was not anger exactly, but was something in the same family. "Officer Malloy and I are going to have a very long conversation," he said, "and there are going to be consequences." "That's between you and him," Caleb said. Gaines looked at him. There was something in Caleb's face that seemed to both surprise and respect him. "You're not going to ask for anything." Caleb thought about it for a moment, thought about the handcuffs, thought about the words Malloy had said about veterans having hard times and making scenes to feel important again, thought about the 15 minutes when a man had chosen his own authority over the plain truth in front of him, and how many seconds had been on that timer, and how many of the 23 people in the parking lot would have been within range. "I'm going to ask you to make sure your officers know what a trained military working dog's alert posture looks like," Caleb said. "And I'm going to ask you to make sure they know that when a veteran tells them there's a bomb, the correct response is not to handcuff the veteran." Gaines nodded slowly. "That is a fair ask," he said, "and I'll make it a direct order." The sun was well up by then, the morning moving toward midday, with the indifference that time had toward the human drama continuing its rotation regardless of what people did beneath it. Caleb could feel the adrenaline fading from his system the way it always faded, leaving behind a particular bone-deep tiredness that was different from ordinary fatigue, cleaner and more honest. He looked down at Ranger. Ranger looked up at him. The dog's dark eyes were steady and calm and entirely present, showing none of the stress that the last hour must have put on him, showing only the patient readiness that was his fundamental condition, the constant willingness to do the thing he had been built to do in whatever moment it was required. Caleb put his hand on the dog's head. Ranger leaned into it just slightly. Around them, the parking lot was slowly transforming from the scene of an evacuation into the scene of an aftermath. People were beginning to talk, beginning to process, beginning to turn to each other with the particular intensity of people who have just shared something they will remember for the rest of their lives. Phones were out again, calls being made, texts being sent, the story radiating outward from this parking lot in Clearwater, Florida, into the wider world that would read it on screens and think about it for a day or a week or a month. Frank Willis was standing near the rear exit of his diner watching all of it. He had been quiet since the evacuation had moved through the morning in the stunned, slightly displaced way of a man whose context had collapsed under him. His building was intact. His customers were safe. And the man he had called the police on the man he had looked at and seen a dangerous drifter in dusty clothes and a military dog was standing in the parking lot of his diner having a quiet, direct conversation with the chief of police, while that same dog sat at his side and watched the world with calm, professional eyes. Frank looked at Caleb. He was going to have to do something about that. He knew it. He could feel it building in him, the knowledge that he had done something wrong, and that the wrongness of it was not going to leave him alone until he addressed it directly. But that moment was still a few minutes away. For now, the parking lot held all of them. The bomb had been stopped. The building was standing. The little girl was still petting Ranger, who was tolerating it with infinite gentle patience. Thomas Reed was talking to Harris's team with the animated gestures of a man comparing notes with professionals he genuinely respected. And Caleb Walker stood in the Florida sun, smelling of the diner's kitchen and his own long morning, looking at nothing in particular, while around him, the world sorted itself out. He was not thinking about what he'd done. He was not thinking about the timer, or the device, or the 19 minutes, or the moment the handcuffs had come off. He was thinking about his beach cabin and whether the coffee maker would still be warm when he got there, and whether Ranger would want to run on the beach this afternoon, and whether the Gulf water would be as still as it had been yesterday evening. He was thinking about quiet. He had earned it. Frank Willis had not moved from his spot near the rear exit of the diner for 11 minutes. Caleb knew this because he had tracked him in the way he tracked all variables in a post-incident environment, not with suspicion, just with the automatic awareness that had been built into him over 12 years of operations, where the thing you stopped watching was usually the thing that became a problem. Frank was not a threat. Frank was a man in the process of becoming someone different from who he had been 2 hours ago, and that process was visibly uncomfortable to witness. He was standing with his arms crossed and his eyes moving from the bomb squad equipment to the police cruisers, to Caleb, to Ranger, and back again, making a circuit that had no resolution at the end of it, just the same facts presenting themselves in rotation, demanding to be dealt with. Chief Gaines had moved to the far end of the parking lot with Captain Harris and two of the other officers where they were going through what Caleb recognized as the initial stages of an incident investigation, the careful reconstruction of a sequence of events that were going to have consequences for several people in several directions. Malloy was standing 20 feet from that group, close enough to demonstrate availability, but far enough to demonstrate that he understood he was not currently part of it. His radio was clipped to his belt. His hands were in his pockets. He was looking at the ground. Thomas Reed had found himself a plastic chair that someone had dragged out from the rear of the diner during the evacuation and was sitting in it with the satisfied posture of a man who had done what was required and was content to let the younger people handle the rest. He had a cup of coffee in his hand, which he had produced from somewhere with the quiet resourcefulness of a veteran who knew that the best time to find coffee was in the aftermath of chaos, when everyone else was too wound up to think about drinking it. He caught Caleb's eye across the parking lot and raised the cup slightly. It was a gesture that said simultaneously, "Well done," and also I knew how this was going to go all along. Caleb almost smiled. The news van was still at the end of the block. Two more had joined it in the last 20 minutes, and there were now 3 cameras pointed at the parking lot from the established press perimeter, their lenses covering everything with the hungry patience of equipment built for exactly this kind of moment. A reporter in a blue blazer was talking into a microphone with the practiced urgency of someone converting raw events into narrative for an audience that was not yet aware the story existed. Ranger sat at Caleb's side, and a small boy who had apparently materialized from somewhere in the gathered crowd was now crouched beside the dog with an expression of pure reverence, watching Ranger, the way the young watch things that seemed to them both magical and true. "What's his name?" the boy asked, looking up at Caleb. "Ranger," Caleb said. "Did he really find a bomb?" "Yes," Caleb said. The boy looked back at Ranger with new dimensions of awe. "That's the coolest thing I've ever heard in my entire life," he said with the complete unconditional conviction of childhood. Caleb looked down at the palm and then at his palm and felt something move through him that was too large and too complicated to have a clean name. He let it move through and didn't try to label it. "Yeah," he said quietly. "He's pretty cool." It was at that moment, 41 minutes after the bomb squad had arrived, and 22 minutes after the device had been neutralized, that Frank Willis started walking toward him. Caleb saw him coming and stayed where he was. He did not arrange his face into anything welcoming or hostile. He just watched the man walk across the parking lot with the increasingly deliberate steps of someone who has made a decision and is afraid that if he slows down, he'll unmake it. Frank stopped in front of him. He was about 6 feet away, and he stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides and his eyes on Caleb's face, and Caleb could see the exact quality of the struggle happening behind those eyes. This was not a man who apologized easily. This was not a man whose self-image included being wrong in this particular way. Frank Willis had built something real in this town over 30 years. He had built it on his own judgment, his own read of situations and people. And his judgment this morning had been so completely, so potentially catastrophically wrong that the whole weight of it was only now finishing its landing on him. "Mr. Walker," Frank said. "Mr. Willis," Caleb said. Frank took a breath. "I need to say something to you." "Okay." "What I did this morning." Frank stopped. His jaw tightened. He tried again. "The way I responded to you when you walked in, the assumptions I made about you, about what you were, what kind of man you were, what you were doing in my place." He shook his head slowly. "I took one look at you and I decided who you were. And then I called the police based on who I decided you were, not on what you were actually telling me." He paused. "People could have died in my diner today because I wouldn't listen to a man who was trying to help me, because of the way he looked." Caleb was quiet. He let Frank have the space to finish. "I'm sorry," Frank said. and the words came out plain and undecorated without the elaborate packaging that people sometimes put around apologies to make them easier to deliver. I am genuinely deeply sorry, not because of what almost happened, because of what I did, because of who I showed myself to be this morning. He looked at Ranger. And I'm sorry to your dog, which I know is a strange thing to say, but he did everything right and I was part of why nobody was listening. Caleb held the apology for a moment. He had received apologies before in his life, some genuine, some performative, some somewhere in between. This one felt like the first kind. I appreciate that, Frank, he said. I mean it. Frank nodded, something releasing in his posture. Then he said, can I ask you something? Go ahead. When you came in, when Ranger stopped, you knew immediately, didn't you? There was no question in your mind. No question, Caleb said. How, Frank asked, and the question was genuine, was the question of a man trying to understand something that had been entirely outside his frame of reference this morning. How were you that certain? Caleb looked at Ranger. Because I know him, he said simply. 7 years. I know every movement he makes, every variation in how he holds himself. What he did by that trash bin was not a behavior I had ever seen in him, except in one specific context. You learn to trust what you know. He paused. The problem is that most people trust what they see over what they're told. And what they saw this morning was a guy in old clothes with a big dog making claims they had no framework to evaluate. I understand why that's hard to receive. Frank was quiet for a moment. That doesn't excuse it, he said. No, Caleb agreed. It doesn't, but it explains it. And understanding why something went wrong is how you make sure it doesn't go wrong again. Frank looked at him for a long moment. Something in his face had settled, had found a place to rest that wasn't comfort exactly, but was the beginning of the process that led toward it. I'd like to put Ranger's picture up in the diner, he said, if that's okay with you. When we reopen, I want people to know what happened here, what he did. Caleb considered it. Ask me again when this is all sorted out, he said. Frank nodded and walked away, and Caleb watched him go. The investigative process was gathering momentum at the far end of the parking lot, and Caleb knew from experience that it was only a matter of minutes before it reached him in a formal way. There would be statements to give. There would be questions to answer. There would be the particular institutional machinery of law enforcement processing an incident that had involved one of their own officers behaving badly and a civilian being right about something that could have killed dozens of people. That machinery was necessary, and Caleb didn't resist it, but he was tired in a way that was settling deeper into his bones by the minute. Thomas appeared at his elbow. He had finished his coffee and was holding the empty cup with the absent-minded grip of a man whose hands needed something to do when his mind was working. Chief's going to want your formal statement in about 5 minutes, Thomas said. I know. You okay? Caleb thought about the question. I'll be better when I'm on the highway, he said. Thomas made a sound that was agreement and understanding, and the specific empathy of one veteran for another compressed into a single syllable. Then he said, I need to tell you something. Caleb looked at him. When I stood up in that diner, Thomas said, I wasn't just responding to Ranger's posture. I was responding to you. He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who said things he meant. The way you were talking to Malloy, the patience of it. The way you kept your voice level when any reasonable man would have been screaming. I've known a lot of men who went through things that rewire you. Some of them come out of it angry. Some of them come out broken. Some of them come out with this, he searched for the word, this steadiness. Like they've been tested so many times that the testing has made them into something the testing can't reach anymore. He looked at Caleb. You've got that. And I thought, if a man like that is telling me there's a bomb in that trash bin, I should probably listen. Caleb held this. Thank you, Thomas, he said, for standing up. You know, that changed everything. Ranger changed everything, Thomas said firmly. I just gave people permission to see what he'd already shown them. Caleb almost said something and then stopped because there was something in what Thomas had just said that was more precisely true than anything Caleb himself might have put into words about the morning, and he didn't want to dilute it. It was Thomas who broke the silence. What's he trained in exactly besides explosives? Patrol tracking, suspect apprehension, Caleb said. But he was always best at detection. He's got a nose that... He shook his head. There's no technology that reliably beats a trained dog. People spend billions of dollars on detection equipment, and then they meet a dog like Ranger, and they understand why the equipment is the backup and the dog is the primary. Thomas was nodding. Vietnam, we had a dog handler in our unit, scout dog, Labrador mix named Carter. He paused. Carter found 3 tunnel entrances in 6 weeks that nobody else found. Saved the unit twice that I know of for certain. He was quiet for a moment. Handler's name was Billy Reeves, good kid from Mississippi. Another pause longer. He didn't make it home. Carter did. The weight of that settled between them, and they let it rest there because some things deserve the weight of a moment's silence rather than the cover of words. Then Caleb said, Carter sounds like a good dog. Best I ever knew, Thomas said. Till today. Caleb looked at Ranger as if he understood that he was being discussed, turned his head and looked calmly back at both of them with those dark, steady eyes that missed nothing and communicated in the language of pure presence. Chief Gaines was walking toward them now, with Captain Harris at his shoulder and a uniformed officer with a notepad taking the outside position of the triangle. Caleb straightened slightly, not at attention, just present, just ready. Mr. Walker, Gaines said, I need to go through the formal sequence of this morning with you if you are willing. I'm willing, Caleb said. They went through it methodically, Gaines asking questions and Caleb answering them in the clear, factual, chronological way that he had given after-action reports for 12 years, and Harris adding technical commentary on the device findings at the relevant points. The device had been a timer-based EIED using a commercial alarm clock mechanism and a primary charge that Harris described with the careful terminology of his profession. Dense, compact, positioned for maximum effect given the geometry of the space. Someone had known what they were doing. We're treating this as a deliberate targeted attack, Gaines said at one point. The diner specifically, the timing, the placement, this was planned. Any idea of the target? Caleb asked. Gaines and Harris exchanged a glance. Early stage investigation, Gaines said. We don't have that yet, but we will. He looked at Caleb. I want you to know that your presence here this morning and your dog's detection is the reason we have something to investigate instead of a catastrophic scene. He said it plainly without the inflated language of official commendations which made it land harder. Ranger's nose, Caleb said. That's the reason. Harris nodded in agreement. I've worked with detection dogs, he said. I've seen good ones and great ones. What that dog did in there, maintaining an independent alert without his handler present in an unfamiliar space with a room full of strangers reacting around him. He shook his head. That's exceptional. That's a level of training and drive that you don't manufacture. That's a dog that understands what he's doing. Caleb felt something in his chest tighten in a way that was not pain, but was adjacent to it. He always has, he said quietly. They finished the formal statement 20 minutes later, and by then the parking lot had taken on the character of an extended aftermath. The emergency vehicles gradually reduced to 2 cruisers. The bomb squad truck preparing to depart the crowd at the perimeter, thinned by time, and the natural drift of people who had been watching something they couldn't fully see and eventually found the spectacle insufficient. The mother with the 4-year-old was still there. Caleb noticed her because she had made no move to leave since the device had been neutralized, and she had positioned herself at a slight distance from the main group in the way of someone who was waiting for a specific thing rather than just waiting. Her daughter was asleep against her shoulder, the complete trusting unconsciousness of small children who made no distinction between crisis and ordinariness and found both equally compatible with a nap. The mother's name Caleb would learn was Christine Aldis. She was 31 years old. She and her daughter Emma had been at Harbor Light Diner for their Saturday morning ritual, the same table by the window every week for the last 2 years, pancakes with extra syrup for Emma and black coffee and an omelet for Christine. She had a younger sister who worked the Saturday morning shift at a hospital 2 miles away. She had a husband who was currently driving back from a work trip 2 states away after she had called him from the parking lot with shaking hands and told him what had happened. She was in the most ordinary and complete sense possible, exactly the kind of person for whom the morning could have become entirely different. The kind of person that the 20 minutes on that timer, had they not been stopped, would have made into something no one recovers from. She walked over to Caleb. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood in front of him with Emma sleeping on her shoulder and her eyes doing the work of trying to express something that her mouth apparently didn't have words for yet. Caleb waited. "I was sitting 10 feet from that bin," she said finally. "Me and Emma, 10 feet. "I know," Caleb said. "I watched them bring that robot in, and I watched the screen on the tablet," she said. "I couldn't see it clearly, but I could see enough. And I thought about—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, composed herself with the visible effort of a woman who did not want to come apart in front of a stranger and was determined to get through what she needed to say first. "I thought about what would have happened if you had just driven past. If Ranger hadn't—" She stopped again, steadied. "I'm going to think about that for the rest of my life. That there was a version of today that existed right next to this one, and the only thing standing between them was a dog that wouldn't move." Caleb looked at her daughter sleeping against her shoulder. He looked at the small hand curled against the mother's collar, the complete unconscious trust of it. "He didn't do it alone," Caleb said. "Thomas stood up when it mattered. You stayed calm when it mattered. Your daughter," he paused. "She was the first one to be kind to Ranger after everything was over. That meant something." Christine made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a mun, but was something in the narrow human space between them. "She loves dogs," she said. "She has no idea what she did." She looked at him. "But I do, and I need you to know that I'm going to spend the rest of my life being grateful that you stopped at this diner this morning." Caleb had nothing to say to that, so he just nodded and let her gratitude be what it was, which was real and large and completely deserved, even if he didn't know how to carry it comfortably. She reached out and touched Ranger's head gently. Not the tentative gesture of someone uncertain about the dog, but the deliberate, meaningful touch of someone making contact with something they wanted to honor. Ranger accepted it with the stillness he brought to most things. "Thank you," she said to the one in the direct, completely unself-conscious way that people sometimes spoke to animals when they needed to say something too large for social convention. "Thank you." Then she walked to her car, settled Emma into the car seat with the practiced efficiency of a mother who had done it 1,000 times, and this time felt every second of it, and drove away. Caleb watched her go. He did not notice immediately that the crowd had thinned to the point where he was nearly alone in the near section of the parking lot. Thomas had drifted toward the bomb squad truck to continue his conversation with Harris's team. Gaines and his officers were at the far end near the cruisers, deep in the logistics of the investigation. Malloy was gone, taken away at some point in the last hour in one of the police vehicles. Caleb wasn't sure exactly when. He was, for the first time since he had walked through the front door of Harbor Light Diner that morning, effectively alone. Alone with Ranger, and with the particular quality of silence that descended on a scene after an emergency had resolved the silence. That was not absence of sound, but absence of urgency, the settling of the air after it had been disturbed. He sat down on the curb. Ranger sat beside him. He did not think about anything in particular for a few minutes. He allowed himself that. He just sat in the Florida sun with his dog and felt the tiredness move through him and let it. Then Ranger pressed his nose against Caleb's arm. It was not his alert posture. It was not a trained behavior. It was the simple, ancient thing that dogs did for people. They were bonded to the physical reminder of presence, of connection, of the fact that whatever had just happened, they had been through it together. Caleb put his arm around the dog's shoulders. Ranger leaned into him. "Yeah," Caleb said, "I know." He wasn't sure how long they sat there. Long enough for the sun to shift. Long enough for the last bomb squad vehicle to depart. Long enough for the news vans to realize that the active scene was over and begin the process of repositioning for the press conference that Gaines would undoubtedly hold later that afternoon. It was the sound of a car door and approaching footsteps that brought him back. The man walking toward him was someone Caleb had not seen before in the morning's events, which meant he had arrived recently. He was in his mid-40s in plain clothes, with the particular posture of someone in federal law enforcement who was not currently making that fact explicit. He stopped a few feet from Caleb and produced a credential case with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Walker, Special Agent Dana Mercer, ATF. I've been briefed on this morning's events, and I need to speak with you if you have a few minutes." Caleb looked at the credential. Then he looked at Mercer's face. "A TF," he said. "The device construction," Mercer said. "It matches a profile we've been tracking for several weeks. This is not the first one." He paused to let that settle. "It's the third." The parking lot seemed to become very still. Caleb could feel something shift in the quality of the morning, some door opening onto a space that was larger and darker than the immediate events of the day. Where were the others? Caleb asked. Georgia, Mercer said. Tennessee. Both crowded public spaces. Both timed for peak hours. He looked at Caleb steadily. Both went off. The weight of that landed on the curb beside Caleb and did not move. Casualties? Caleb asked. 14 in Georgia, Mercer said. 9 in Tennessee. 3 fatalities total. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the rear entrance of Harbor Light Diner. He thought about the people who had been inside this morning, about the mother and the 4-year-old, and the old men at the counter, and the teenagers with their phones, and Thomas Reed finishing his scrambled eggs, and Josie with her stack of menus, and the line cooks at the grill. He thought about Georgia, about Tennessee, about the people in those spaces who had not had a German Shepherd 3 steps inside the door. You are going to want to know everything about the placement, Caleb said. The exact position of the bin, whether it had been moved from its usual location. Yes, Mercer said. And you're going to want to look at the security footage from the last 48 hours if the diner has it. Already requested, Mercer said. He paused. Mr. Walker, I want to be direct with you. This investigation is going to be complex and it's going to take time. But your dog's detection this morning may have given us the first complete device to analyze from this series. The first one they didn't get to detonate. He let that sit. That's significant, in terms of what we can learn about who built it and how. Caleb absorbed this. He understood what Mercer was telling him without Mercer having to elaborate. Ranger had done more than save the people in this diner. He had potentially handed federal investigators the physical evidence they needed to stop whoever was doing this from doing it again. I'll give you everything I have, Caleb said. I'd appreciate that, Mercer said. They talked for another 30 minutes, Caleb going through the morning again, with the additional layer of detail that federal investigation required, the specific angle of Ranger's nose, the exact distance from the doorway, the quality of the alert, the behaviors that would distinguish TATP from RDX in Ranger's response pattern, details that Harris's team had already gathered, but that Mercer wanted directly from the handler. When they finished, Mercer handed Caleb a card and shook his hand, and then he was gone, moving back toward the building and the investigation, with the efficient purposefulness of a man who had several more hours of work ahead of him today. Caleb looked at the card in his hand. He looked at Ranger. He looked at the clear Florida sky above the parking lot and the ordinary business of the day continuing on the street beyond the police perimeter. People walking with coffee, a delivery driver unloading at the business across the street, the basic, persistent normalcy of a world that accommodated disasters and their prevention into its daily rhythm without pausing. Thomas Reed had drifted back and was standing nearby, having apparently finished with the bomb squad team. Federal, Thomas asked, nodding toward where Mercer had been standing. A TFE here, Caleb said. Thomas's eyebrows moved. Series, well, third device, Caleb said. The others went off. Thomas went quiet. He processed this with the same interior economy he brought to all difficult information. Then he said, So Ranger didn't just save this room. Looks that way, Caleb said. Thomas looked at the bay. Ranger looked back at him with calm, patient equanimity. Finest kind, Thomas said again, softer this time, like the words meant even more the second time he said them. Caleb stood up from the curb. His knees felt the morning in them, which was new enough to notice. He brushed off his cargo pants and looked around the parking lot, taking inventory one final time, the way he always did before leaving a location. Chief Gaines was walking back toward him from the far end of the lot, and beside Gaines, slightly behind him, was Malloy. Caleb watched them come. Malloy had aged in the last 2 hours, not in any physical way that could be measured, but in the invisible way that a person aged when they understood something about themselves that they had not understood before, when a mirror had been held up and they had been required to look at what was in it. He walked with his hands at his sides and his eyes on Caleb's face, and there was none of the practiced authority in him now, none of the performative command that he had walked into the diner with. What was there instead was harder to look at because it was just a man. Gaines stopped a few feet away. Malloy stopped beside him. Officer Malloy has something he'd like to say, Gaines said, and then he took a step back because this was not his moment to occupy. Malloy stood in front of Caleb and Ranger in the Florida sun in the parking lot of Harbor Light Diner, and he said, I put handcuffs on a man who was trying to save everyone in that building. I dismissed a trained dog's warning because I was more interested in my own authority than in the truth in front of me. His voice was steady, but cost him visibly. I failed at the most basic thing a law enforcement officer is supposed to do, which is to protect people. And the people in that diner were protected today in spite of me, not because of me. He paused. I don't know how to make that right. I don't know if it can be made right, but I needed you to hear me say it clearly. Caleb looked at him for a moment. He thought about the handcuffs. He thought about what Malloy had said about veterans trying to feel important. He thought about the timer, and then he thought about something his commanding officer had told him once, a long time ago, in a context very different from a diner parking lot in Florida. The measure of a person isn't the mistake they make under pressure. It's what they do with it afterward. I heard you, Caleb said. Clear. Malloy nodded. Something in him seemed to settle not into comfort, but into the beginning of whatever came next. Gaines stepped forward again. He looked at Caleb with a directness that had no performance in it. I'm placing Officer Malloy on administrative leave pending a full departmental review of his conduct this morning, he said. That's the institutional piece. The personal piece. He paused. The personal piece is that I'm going to make what happened here part of our department's training going forward. Military working dogs, veteran communication, the specific alert postures. My officers are going to know what Ranger was doing this morning. They're going to know it because they're going to be taught it and because they're going to watch the footage from this morning and understand what it costs to not listen. Caleb nodded. I'll send you Ranger's certification documentation and the training protocols if that helps. It would help a great deal, Gaines said. They shook hands. And then it was finally over. Not the investigation, not the legal proceedings, not the federal case or the departmental review, or the questions that Clearwater was going to be asking for weeks. But for Caleb Walker in this parking lot on this morning that had started as a drive to the beach and become something else entirely, it was over. He clipped Ranger's leash. He walked toward his black pickup at the edge of the lot. The truck sat where he had left it, faded and patient, indifferent to everything that had happened in its vicinity in the last 2 hours. He opened the rear door for Ranger. The dog jumped in and arranged himself on the back seat with the unhurried competence of an animal who had exactly one mode and lived in it completely. Caleb got in. He started the engine. He sat for a moment in the familiar quiet of the cab, with the sound of the engine and the smell of the truck and the particular texture of a morning that had not gone the way anyone had planned. In the rearview mirror, he could see the parking lot. He could see Gaines and Harris in conversation. He could see Thomas Reed, who had found another cup of coffee from somewhere and was drinking it on the curb with the satisfied air of a man who had done enough for one day. He could see Frank Willis standing at the rear entrance of his diner, looking at the building that was still standing because of a dog that had refused to move and a man that no one had wanted to believe. He pulled out of the parking lot and turned onto the street, and the diner disappeared behind him, and the road opened up ahead, and the beach was 40 minutes away, and Ranger was already asleep in the back seat. Caleb drove. He drove the way he did most things, quietly and without unnecessary movement, with the sun coming through the windshield and the flat Florida landscape moving past, in the particular feeling of a day that had asked something large of him and gotten it. He didn't feel like a hero. He never did. Heroes were a story people told about a moment after the moment was over, a way of making meaning out of what had been in the actual experience of it. Just a series of decisions made under pressure, with whatever tools and knowledge and character you had available. He had done what he knew how to do. Ranger had done what Ranger knew how to do. Thomas Reed had stood up when standing up was what was needed. The rest had been, in the most essential sense, simple. He drove and the road stretched ahead, and somewhere behind him, in a parking lot in Clearwater, Florida, a group of people were standing in the sun, processing a morning they would tell their families about tonight, that some of them would tell their children about years from now, that a few of them would carry with them in the particular way that close calls were carried as a permanent awareness of the thinness of the boundary between what happened and what almost happened. He drove and Ranger slept, and the highway unrolled under the wheels of the black pickup truck, and neither of them needed to say anything because they already knew everything that needed to be known between them. The beach was waiting. It had been a very long morning. He had been at the beach cabin for exactly 47 minutes when his phone rang. Caleb had not turned the ringer off, which meant he had expected this on some level, had understood that the morning was not the kind that let you simply drive away from it and have it stay behind. He was sitting on the small porch with a cup of black coffee and Ranger stretched out on the wooden boards beside him, the dog's eyes closed, his chest rising and falling with the deep, even breath of an animal that had completed its mission and felt no further obligation to the world until the next one. Caleb had been watching the water, which was the thing he did when he needed his mind to quiet, letting the rhythm of it work on him, the way it had worked on him since he was a child, since long before the Navy, since before he understood that the ocean was practicing the same patience on every shore it touched endlessly without complaint. The phone screen showed a number he didn't recognize. Clearwater area code. He answered. Mr. Walker, this is Sandra Reyes. I'm a reporter with the Tampa Bay Tribune. I'm covering the Harbor Light Diner incident, and I'd like to... He ended the call. It rang again 40 seconds later. Different number, same area code. He let it go to voicemail. In the next 22 minutes, his phone rang 6 more times. He answered none of them. He sat with his coffee and watched the water and let the calls come and go the way he let most things come and go, with the patient, deliberate non-attachment that he had spent years cultivating in the space between the man he had been trained to be and the man he was trying to become. Ranger opened one eye, looked at the phone, looked at Caleb, and closed it again. His opinion on the matter was clear. Yeah, Caleb said. I know. The 7th call was from a number he recognized. Thomas Reed's cell, which Caleb had taken down in the parking lot with the instinct of a man who always knew which people were worth staying in contact with. He answered. You watching the news? Thomas said without preamble. No. You should be. I shouldn't be, Caleb said. Thomas made a sound that contained a laugh inside it. Fair enough, I'll tell you what's on it. Your face, Ranger's face, the diner, footage from about 4 different phones, and a chyron at the bottom of the screen that says direct quote, decorated Navy SEAL handcuffed by local officer while bomb ticked in diner. Caleb was quiet for a moment. How's it playing? How do you think it's playing? Thomas said. People are furious. The phone footage of Malloy putting the cuffs on you is getting shared everywhere. I've seen it posted 17 times in the last hour on my granddaughter's Facebook, and I don't even have an account. He paused. Malloy's name is out there. His personnel record is out there. Somebody found 3 prior complaints of excessive force. One was substantiated. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. He had not wanted this from Malloy specifically, not the public version of it, not the trial by social media that burned through a person's life with the speed and selectivity of fire. He had wanted accountability through the proper channels. He understood rationally that those channels were slow, and that the public version was often the thing that made the proper channels actually function. But understanding something rationally and finding it comfortable were different things. And Ranger, Caleb said. Thomas's voice changed. Ranger is the hero of the story, he said simply and warmly. Every version of the story, every platform. The video of him sitting beside that bin, holding his alert while chaos went on around him. The video of Emma petting him in the parking lot. People are... He paused, searching for the word. People are moved by it, Caleb. Genuinely moved. Not in the way of a news cycle. In the way of something that reaches a person in a real place. Caleb looked at Ranger, who was still apparently asleep. He's going to hate being famous, he said. He's a dotty, Thomas said. He'll handle it better than you will. Caleb almost smiled. Probably. Gaines is holding a press conference at 4 o'clock, Thomas said. He's going to make a formal statement about Malloy and a formal commendation of you and Ranger. He called me to ask if I'd be present. Are you going? Yes, Thomas said. I'm going because what happened this morning deserves to be said out loud by the people with the authority to say it, and I want to be there to make sure it's said right. A pause. He asked about you. What did you tell him? I told him I'd pass along the invitation, Thomas said, and that I had no idea whether you'd come. Caleb looked at the water. He thought about press conferences. He thought about cameras and microphones and the particular discomfort of public attention, which he had always experienced as a kind of pressure applied from the outside of himself, trying to compress him into a shape that wasn't his actual shape. He had never been good at being watched and had never wanted to be. The things he was best at happened in the absence of an audience. Thomas, he said, yeah. Did Gaines give any more information about who planted the device? The pause that followed was a fraction of a second too long, and Caleb noticed it. That's actually the other reason I called, Thomas said, and his voice shifted register, becoming the voice he used when he was about to say something he'd been holding carefully. Mercer called me, the ATF agent. He called you, Caleb said. He got my number from Gaines. He's talking to everyone who was in that diner this morning. Thomas paused again. He told me something he said he was going to tell you as well, and he wanted me to have the information because of my military background. A breath. They identified the person on the security footage, the one who placed the device. Caleb was very still. Who? Young man, Thomas said. 23 years old. Name hasn't been released publicly yet, but Mercer told me something about the background. Another pause weighted differently than the others. He's a veteran, Caleb, Army. Did one tour in Afghanistan. Was discharged 14 months ago. Mercer said the preliminary profile suggests severe untreated PTSD combined with what they're calling radicalization through an online network that targets veterans experiencing mental health crises. The coffee in Caleb's hand had gone cold. He had not noticed. The other devices, he said, Georgia, Tennessee, were those? The network, Thomas said. Not all the same individual, but the same network. Same ideology, same methodology of recruiting people who came home broken and found something that gave them a mission when the one they trained for was taken away. His voice had something in it now that Caleb recognized because he had heard it in his own voice, sometimes the specific grief of men who understood the pipeline from service to abandonment to something dark, who had seen it happen to people they knew, who understood that the distance between where they stood and where it led was not always as large as the comfortable world liked to believe. Caleb was quiet for a long time. 14 months out, he said finally. Yes, Thomas said. Did he have any support services? VA anything? Mercer didn't give me that level of detail, but based on what he described, Thomas stopped. No, I don't think so. Caleb sat with this. He sat with the particular complexity of it, the way it refused to be simple, the way it pushed against the clean narrative of the morning where there were heroes and a threat and a resolution. And now there was this, a 23-year-old kid who had come home from a war and fallen through every crack there was to fall through and landed somewhere in the dark where people had handed him a mission and a target and the skills to act on both. He was not excusing it. What had been placed in that diner was real, and the people who had nearly died because of it were real, and the people in Georgia and Tennessee who had not been as lucky were devastatingly real. There was no version of this where the math simplified into something forgivable. But he understood it, and understanding it sat in his chest like something heavy and jagged that didn't have a place to go. Why are you telling me this? Caleb asked. Not defensively, just wanting to know. Because Thomas said, I think you're going to decide that the press conference doesn't matter, and the commendation doesn't matter, and the story going around on the news doesn't matter, and you're going to sit at your beach cabin and let everyone else handle the public part of this morning. And I think that's probably fine and probably correct for you personally. A pause. But I also think that you specifically have something to say about what happens to veterans who come home and get nothing. And the press conference is a microphone, and the microphone is there. Caleb said nothing. I'm not telling you what to do, Thomas said. I'm 71 years old. I stopped telling people what to do when I stopped having the rank to enforce it. But I'm telling you what I see. And what I see is a man who saved 23 people this morning with his dog and his discipline and his refusal to be anything other than exactly what he was. And I think that man has something worth saying. Another pause, the longest one. The kid who put that device in there, he was also exactly what he was, and nobody talked about it until he showed up in a security camera placing a bomb. The words settled on the porch and did not leave. Caleb put his coffee down. He looked at Ranger. Ranger had opened both eyes now and was watching him with the steady, attentive expression he wore when he understood that a decision was being made. 4 o'clock, Caleb said. 4 o'clock, Thomas confirmed. Caleb ended the call. He sat for another 3 minutes looking at the water. Then he stood up, went inside, and changed his shirt. He arrived at the Clearwater Police Department headquarters at 3:48. The press contingent outside had expanded significantly from the 3 vans he'd last seen. He counted 11 cameras as he pulled into the lot, and the presence of satellite uplink trucks told him this had stopped being a local story sometime in the last 2 hours. He had known it would. He had known it and driven to the beach anyway, and he didn't regret that because the beach had given him what he needed, which was the 47 minutes of quiet in which to decide who he was going to be in the next hour. Ranger was with him. Ranger was always with him. The dog rode in the back seat with the composure of someone who had been to press conferences before which he had not, but whose general orientation toward new environments was the same as his orientation toward everything which was calm, alert, and completely unintimidated. Thomas Reed was waiting outside the main entrance. He had changed his shirt too. He saw Caleb and Ranger coming, and something in his face settled the way a person's face settled when they had been uncertain about something and had just gotten their answer. "Glad you came," Thomas said. "Don't make a big deal of it," Caleb said. "I make a big deal of what I want," Thomas said pleasantly. "I'm 71. It's one of the benefits." They went inside. Chief Gaines was in a hallway near the briefing room, going over talking points with a communications officer who was holding a clipboard with the particular tension of someone who had been handed a situation they had not anticipated when they got up that morning. Gaines saw Caleb and Thomas, and his expression moved through something that was part relief and part gratitude and part the particular respect of one serious person encountering another. "Mr. Brebar," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for being here." "Thomas made a compelling argument," Caleb said. Gaines looked at Thomas, who was examining the ceiling tile with elaborate innocence. "Before we go out there," Gaines said, bringing his attention back to Caleb, "I want to update you on a few developments." He glanced at the communications officer. "Give us a minute, please." The officer stepped away. Gaines looked at Caleb and lowered his voice. "Mercer's team has made an arrest. The individual identified on the security footage was taken into federal custody approximately 90 minutes ago. I've been briefed on the background, and I'm going to address it carefully in the press conference because it's complicated and it needs to be handled with precision." "Thomas told me," Caleb said, "about the veteran aspect." Gaines nodded. "There's going to be a conversation in this country about that. There should be. There's been a conversation that needed to happen for a long time about what we do with the people who come home and don't get what they need. Today made it impossible to have that conversation quietly." He looked at Caleb directly. "I'd like you to say something, if you're willing, not about Malloy, not about this morning's specific events, but about," he paused, searching, "about what it looks like when it goes right, when someone comes home and finds what they need to keep functioning. Because you're an example of that, and that matters, and people need to see it." Caleb thought about this. He thought about what Thomas had said on the phone about the kid who had come home and fallen through the cracks. He thought about his own homecoming, which had not been easy, which had involved years of therapy and the VA system's grinding inadequacy, and the particular loneliness of being a person whose experiences didn't translate into the language of civilian life. He thought about Ranger, who had been the thing that finally gave him a structure around which the rest could reorganize itself, who had been in a very real sense the anchor that kept him from drifting. He thought about a 23-year-old who hadn't had that anchor. "Okay," he said. The press conference was held in the department briefing room, which had been rearranged to accommodate the number of cameras and reporters that had arrived from as far as Atlanta and Washington. Caleb stood at the back with Ranger while Gaines opened with the formal statement covering the incident sequence, the device confirmation, the evacuation, the federal arrest, all of it delivered with the careful, deliberate precision of a man who understood that every word he said would be examined and quoted and contextualized in ways he couldn't fully predict. He addressed Malloy's conduct directly and without hedging. Administrative leave pending investigation. Department review. Pattern of conduct to be examined. No equivocation, no defensive framing, no institutional protection of one of his own at the expense of what was true. Caleb watched the reporters in the room writing rapidly and thought that Gaines was whatever else he was, a man who understood that the way to preserve institutional credibility was to not protect the institution from its failures. Then Gaines turned and looked toward the back of the room and said, "I'd like to introduce Caleb Walker and his service dog Ranger, whose actions this morning prevented what would have been a catastrophic loss of life in our community." The room turned. Caleb walked forward. Ranger walked beside him. The cameras tracked them with the synchronized attention of equipment following a story it recognized as significant, and the reporters watched with the slightly different attention of people encountering someone who was not what they had assembled in their minds based on the footage they'd seen. He was not cleaned up. He had changed his shirt, but he was still wearing the same cargo pants, still wearing the boots he had worn into the diner that morning, still carrying the beard and the gray eyes and the quiet that didn't change based on the size of the room he was in. He stood at the podium and looked at the cameras and did not arrange himself into anything other than what he was. He spoke for 4 minutes. He did not talk about being a hero. He talked about Ranger, about what the dog represented in terms of training and trust and the bond between a handler and a military working dog. He talked about what it meant to have a partner whose communication you had learned to receive completely, and how that kind of trust was built over years, and how it had been built in service of the people who needed it. Then he paused and the room was very quiet, and he said the thing he had come to say. There's something else that's true about this morning, and I want to say it while there are cameras here, because I don't know when I'll have another chance. He looked at his hands on the podium for a moment, then back up. The person who placed that device was 23 years old. He was a veteran. He served this country in Afghanistan. He came home 14 months ago, and somewhere between coming home and this morning, he fell through every safety net we have for people in his situation. And he found other people who gave him a mission when he had none, who gave him a purpose when we didn't. He paused. I'm not here to excuse what he did. There is no excusing it. But I want everyone in this room to understand that we are failing our veterans at a rate that should terrify us. We are taking people who have been trained to operate at the absolute limit of human capacity under the absolute worst conditions that human beings can create for each other, and we are bringing them home and handing them a clipboard and a waiting list and the number for a crisis hotline and calling that support. His voice was steady. It isn't. It isn't anywhere close to enough. And if we don't fix it, we are going to keep producing the conditions for mornings like this one. The room was completely silent. Ranger sat at his side and said nothing because Ranger never needed to say anything, because Ranger's entire existence in that moment was saying it for him. The living proof of what happened when a veteran got what he needed, when the bond between a man and an animal and a mission was allowed to function the way it was built to function, when coming home didn't mean falling through the floor. A reporter raised her hand. Mr. Walker, do you think Officer Malloy's response to you this morning was connected to bias against veterans? Caleb looked at her. I think Officer Malloy made assumptions based on appearance and didn't adjust them when the evidence contradicted them. Whether that's bias specifically against veterans or something more general, I'm not qualified to say. What I can say is that it's a problem that has a solution, which is training, and Chief Gaines has committed to that training. I'm going to hold him to it. Another hand. What would you say to the people in Georgia and Tennessee who weren't as lucky as the people in Clearwater today? The question landed the way hard questions landed, with the weight of what they contained, which was grief and accountability, and the plain unfairness of a world where the difference between survival and catastrophe was sometimes the specific trajectory of one dog's nose on one particular morning. Caleb was quiet for a moment. I'd say I'm sorry, he said. I'm sorry that Ranger wasn't there. I'm sorry that we haven't built a world where he doesn't need to be. He paused. And I'd say that the people who were in those spaces were not unlucky. They were let down. There's a difference. Unlucky implies randomness. Being let down implies something that could have been different, could still be. He stepped back from the podium. Gaines moved back to the microphone and said something formal about the investigation continuing and further updates to follow, but Caleb was already moving toward the side of the room because he had said what he came to say, and everything after it was the machinery running its course. Thomas was beside him as he moved toward the exit. The old Marine said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly, "That was well done." "I meant it," Caleb said. "I know," Thomas said. "That's why it was well done." They came out of the building into the afternoon sun, and the cameras swung toward them, and reporters called questions from behind the established perimeter, and Caleb walked through all of it with Ranger at his side and his eyes forward, not hostile, not performing indifference, just moving in the direction of the truck, which was where he needed to be. His phone was showing 11 missed calls and a text from a number he didn't recognize that said simply, "This is Christine Aldis. I watched the press conference. Thank you for what you said. Emma keeps asking about Ranger. I told her he's a hero. She wants to know if heroes take naps." Caleb stopped walking. He read the text again. He looked at Ranger. He typed back, "He's taking one right now." The response came in less than 30 seconds. "She says that makes sense. Heroes need their rest." Something moved through him, something that started in his chest and moved outward, warm and undefended and completely real. He stood in the parking lot of the Clearwater Police Department with his dad and 11 missed calls and the afternoon light coming at a slant, and he let himself feel it, all of it, the weight and the relief and the particular irreplaceable sense of having done the necessary thing in the necessary moment. He put the phone in his pocket. Thomas had stopped beside him. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Caleb said. "Everything's okay." They stood there for a moment in the good plain way of two veterans who had found each other at the end of a morning that had asked more than most mornings asked, who didn't need to say anything about it to know that the other one understood. "You want to get coffee somewhere that isn't Harbor Light Diner," Thomas said. Caleb looked at him. "Is there a place that would let Ranger in?" Thomas considered this. "I know a place," he said. "Owner's a veteran. He'll not only let Ranger in, he'll bring him a bowl of water and probably apologize for not having something better to offer." "That sounds exactly right," Caleb said. They drove separately and met at a small diner on the eastern edge of town that smelled like the same coffee and bacon as Harbor Light, but had a different quality of light coming through its windows and a handwritten sign on the door that said, "Service animals welcome. All veterans eat free on Fridays." Thomas went in first and exchanged words with a heavy-set man behind the counter who had a military tattoo on his forearm and the kind of face that had seen things and chosen to respond to them by feeding people. The man looked past Thomas at Caleb and Ranger coming through the door, and his expression didn't flicker, didn't assess, didn't make any of the calculations that Frank Willis had made 6 hours earlier in a different diner in the same city. He just nodded and said, "Booth in the back's yours. I'll bring water for the dog." Caleb slid into the booth. Ranger settled under the table with a sigh that was the canine equivalent of a man loosening his collar at the end of a long shift. Thomas sat across from him and picked up the laminated menu and looked at it with the expression of a man who already knew what he was ordering, but appreciated the ritual. The water came for Ranger, coffee came for both of them without being asked. Caleb wrapped his hands around the mug and let the warmth move through his palms. "Tell me about him," Thomas said, not looking up from the menu. "Ranger, how you got him?" Caleb looked at the dog under the table. "I was medically separated in 2019, he said. Knee injury secondary from a vehicle incident in Oman. I was in good shape, mentally better than average, but the transition was," he paused, "hard, in the way it's hard for everyone who doesn't have a war to go back to and doesn't quite fit in the world that's left." He took a breath. "A buddy of mine, former handler, told me about a program that matched veterans with retiring military working dogs that had been decommissioned but weren't suited for regular adoption because of their training level. Too much drive, too much intensity. Regular families couldn't handle them." He looked at Ranger. "I figured I could handle intensity." Thomas smiled. And they brought me this dog, this 78-pound German Shepherd, who had done 4 years of operational service and had a piece of shrapnel under his left shoulder blade that the vet had decided was safer to leave than to remove." He paused. "He walked into the room where they introduced us, and he looked at me, and I looked at him, and I understood in about 30 seconds that we were the same kind of thing, that we had both been built for something specific, and that we needed the specific thing to function." He paused. "He gave me a reason to get up with a purpose every morning. Not a metaphorical purpose, an actual, concrete, physical purpose. This animal needs feeding and training and exercise and engagement, and it needs those things from me specifically because I'm his person. That's real. That's something you can hold on to." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That kid," he said, "the 23-year-old. "Yeah," Caleb said. "He needed something like that," Thomas said. "Yes," Caleb said. "He did." The food came. They ate in the companionable silence of people who had found in a single unexpected morning the particular bond that formed between individuals who had been through something significant together, who had stood in the same moment and made the same choice and come out the other side still standing. Caleb's phone had continued to accumulate missed calls while they ate. He silenced it. He would deal with it later. Some of it would be media he had no interest in speaking to. Some of it would be the VA, which Mercer had apparently contacted on his behalf, something Caleb hadn't asked for but didn't resent. Some of it would be people he didn't know who had found his number through channels he couldn't predict, people who wanted to express things to him that he would receive but didn't need. One of them, he would find out later, was from the commanding officer of his former SEAL team, calling from a number Caleb had not heard from in 2 years, leaving a message that was 3 sentences long and contained within those 3 sentences everything that military men said to each other when they wanted to say something they hadn't learned the civilian language for. One of them was from his mother in Virginia, who had seen the news and was crying not from fear, but from the specific pride of a woman who had spent 38 years watching her son become something she couldn't fully understand and loving every version of it. One of them, most unexpectedly, was from a researcher at a university in Tampa who was studying veteran integration programs and wanted to talk about Ranger, specifically about the therapeutic and operational role of military working dogs in veteran reintegration, about whether Caleb would be willing to be interviewed, about whether he thought the program that had matched them could be expanded. He would call the last one back first, but that was later. That was tomorrow or the day after, when the morning had settled into the past tense, where it could be examined and learned from and used. Right now there was coffee, and a man across the table who had stood up in a diner when standing up was the exact thing required, and a dog under the table who had done something that could not be fully described but also did not need to be, because everyone who had been in that parking lot already knew what it was. "Tell me about Carter," Caleb said. Thomas looked up from his coffee. Something moved in his face that was very old and very present at the same time. "You want to hear about Carter?" "I want to hear about Carter," Caleb said. Thomas set his mug down and leaned back in the booth. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way people looked at the ceiling when they were reaching for something stored a long time ago in a place where it had been carefully kept. "Carter was a yellow lab," he said. "One of the most ugly, ordinary-looking dogs you have ever seen in your life. He had this one ear that went sideways instead of up, made him look like he was always listening to a radio station nobody else could hear." He paused. "But his nose was—" He shook his head. "His nose was an instrument, Caleb, a pure instrument." He talked for 20 minutes. Caleb listened. Ranger slept under the table. The diner made its small sounds around them, the clatter of the kitchen, the murmur of other conversations, the ordinary life of a place where people came to be fed and to sit across from each other and exchange the things that made them who they were. Outside, the afternoon was moving toward evening. The news cycle was running at its full speed, and somewhere in it, the story of a Navy SEAL and a German Shepherd in a Florida diner was already becoming the thing that stories became when they reached enough people, a symbol, a shorthand, a gathering point for everything people felt about service and trust, and the question of who you saw when you looked at a man in dusty boots walking into your establishment on a humid Tuesday morning. Caleb was not thinking about any of that. He was thinking about Carter and about Billy Reeves from Mississippi, and about the yellow lab with the sideways ear who had found 3 tunnel entrances in 6 weeks and come home when his handler didn't, and about all the dogs and all the handlers and all the mornings that had assembled themselves across all the decades of service into this particular morning in this particular city with this particular dog sleeping under this particular table. He was thinking that the thread connecting all of it was real, that it ran from Vietnam to Afghanistan to a diner in Clearwater, Florida, that it was made of loyalty and training and the refusal to stop doing the necessary thing even when the world was not listening. He was thinking that Ranger had known that all along. He reached under the table and put his hand on the dog's side. Ranger breathed steady and deep warm under his palm. Outside, the day was ending. The story was just beginning. And Caleb Walker, for the first time since he had pulled into the Harbor Light Diner parking lot that morning, let himself be exactly where he was without the weight of what had been or the calculation of what came next. Just here, just now, just the coffee and the old Marine's voice and the dog breathing under the table. It was enough. 3 days after the morning at Harbor Light Diner, Caleb's phone rang at 7:14 in the morning, and the number on the screen was one he had never expected to see again. He was sitting on the porch of the beach cabin with his first coffee, Ranger beside him, the water doing what the water always did. He looked at the number for 2 full rings before he answered. "Walker." The voice on the other end was unmistakable. Commander James Holt, retired. The man who had commanded Caleb's SEAL team for 6 of his 12 years of service. The man who had written his commendation letters and his medical separation paperwork, and who had shaken his hand at the gate the day Caleb walked out of the Navy with a knee that would never be what it was, and a mind that was mostly but not entirely intact. "Commander," Caleb said, I watched the press conference, Holt said. 3 times. Caleb waited. What you said about the kid who planted that device, Holt said. About veterans falling through the cracks. About what we owe the people who come home. A pause, like, I've been saying versions of that for 6 years. Nobody put cameras in front of me. Another pause shorter. You did something important, Caleb. I want you to know I said that and I mean it. Caleb looked at the water. I meant what I said. I know you did, Holt said. That's why it worked. He paused again and Caleb could hear him deciding something. I'm calling because of something specific. There's a program, a nonprofit started by a group of former special operations guys 18 months ago. They work with veterans who are at risk, not crisis intervention exactly, more like what you described, getting people paired with the thing that gives them structure. Dogs mostly, working dogs. Some of them retired military like Ranger. Some trained specifically for the program. He paused. They've been trying to expand. They need people who can speak about it, who can be the face of why it matters. A breath. After the press conference, 3 of the program's donors doubled their commitments in 24 hours because of what you said. Caleb was very still. They want to talk to you, Holt said. The program director, her name is Dr. Sarah Okafor. She's a veteran herself, Army clinical psychologist. She's been running this thing on a shoestring, and she's been trying to get anyone to pay attention for a year and a half. And in the last 72 hours, her inbox has apparently become unmanageable. He paused. She asked me to reach out because she thought you might respond better to a call from someone you knew than from a stranger. Caleb sat with this for a moment. He thought about the press conference, about standing at the podium and saying the thing that had needed to be said, and feeling in the moment of saying it that he was aiming at something real rather than performing for a room. He thought about the 23-year-old in federal custody who had done 1 tour in Afghanistan and come home and found nothing waiting for him except the disintegration of a self that had been built for a context that no longer existed. He thought about Ranger sleeping in the back seat of his truck on the drive to the beach, and about Carter, the ugly yellow lab with the sideways ear, and about Billy Reeves from Mississippi who hadn't made it home. He thought about what Thomas had said on the phone 3 days ago. The microphone is there. Give me her number, Caleb said. He called Dr. Sarah Okafor 40 minutes later, after his second coffee, and after Ranger had eaten, and after Caleb had sat with the decision long enough to know it was the right one. She answered on the second ring, and her voice was the voice of someone who had been doing urgent work for a long time on insufficient resources and had just been handed something she hadn't known how to ask for. She was direct. She was specific. She didn't waste time on preamble, and she didn't perform gratitude in a way that made it about her response rather than the work. She told him about the program, about the 47 veterans they had paired with dogs in the last 18 months, about the outcomes, about the 3 they had lost before the pairing happened, and the ones they hadn't lost because it did. She told him about the waiting list, which had 61 names on it, and about the funding gap that stood between those 61 people and what they needed. She talked for 11 minutes. Then she stopped and said, I'm going to ask you something directly, and I want you to feel free to say no. Go ahead, Caleb said. I want you to be on our board, she said. Not as a figurehead, as an active voice, as the person who stands in rooms where decisions get made and says the things you said at that press conference. Because you have something right now that we've never had, which is the world's attention. And attention is the most perishable resource there is. It expires fast, and I want to use it before it does. Caleb listened to the silence after she finished speaking. He listened to the water outside the cabin window. He listened to the sound of Ranger moving across the floor behind him, the particular rhythm of the dog's nails on the wood unhurried and steady. I'm not a public person, Caleb said. I know, Okafor said. Neither am I. I'm a psychologist from Atlanta who started a nonprofit because I watched 2 veterans I knew personally make choices that couldn't be undone. I didn't want to be a public person either, but the work required it. A pause. The work always requires something from us that we wouldn't choose if we had the option. Caleb said, Can I come and see the program first before I commit to anything? Yes, she said immediately. Yes, I'd prefer it. I want you to see what we actually do, not just what I tell you about it. When can you come? Next week, Caleb said. I'll send you everything, she said. After he ended the call, he sat in the cabin with the phone in his hand and looked at nothing for a minute. Then he looked at Ranger. Ranger looked back at him. New mission, Caleb said quietly. Ranger's tail moved once. That was his version of understood. The first of the two things that Caleb had not anticipated happened that same afternoon. He was at the cabin, working through the accumulated messages on his phone with the systematic efficiency he brought to tasks he didn't enjoy, but understood were necessary when a text arrived from Thomas Reed. It said, "Only check your email." He checked it. There was a message from an address he didn't recognize, forwarded by Thomas with no comment. He opened it. It was from a woman named Patricia Reeves. She said she had seen the press conference. She said she was 73 years old and lived in Gulfport, Mississippi. She said her son Billy had been a dog handler in Vietnam, and that his dog Carter had come home when Billy hadn't, and that Carter had lived with her family for 6 more years after the war, and had died on a Thursday afternoon on the front porch of their house in Mississippi with his head on her lap. She said she had been watching the press conference because her granddaughter had sent her the link, and that when Caleb had spoken about Ranger, something in what he said had reached her across the television screen, and she had sat in her kitchen in Gulfport and cried for the first time in many years, not from grief exclusively, but from the feeling of being understood by a stranger about something she had never found the right words for. She said thank you. She said Billy would have loved Ranger. She said Carter would have too. Caleb read the email 3 times. He typed a response that took him 30 minutes to get right, not because the words were complicated, but because they needed to be exact, because this woman deserved exact words for what she had carried for 50 years. He told her that he had heard about Carter from Thomas Reed, who had served with Billy. He told her that Carter had saved the lives of men who had gone home and had children and grandchildren who existed because a yellow lab with a sideways ear had found tunnel entrances that no one else found. He told her that Thomas still carried Carter with him 50 years later, the way soldiers carried the things and people and animals that had mattered in the places that mattered. He told her that Ranger knew about Carter too because Caleb had told him, because he believed that those understood more than people gave them credit for, and that what Ranger had done 3 days ago in a diner in Clearwater was connected to what Carter had done in Vietnam in a way that was real, even if it couldn't be precisely explained. He hit send. Her reply came back 40 minutes later. It was 4 words. "That is exactly right." He forwarded it to Thomas. Thomas's response was 1 word. Yes. The second thing he had not anticipated happened on Thursday. He drove back to Clearwater because Chief Gaines had requested his presence for the formal departmental commendation, which was the institutional version of what had already happened publicly at the press conference, the slower, more permanent record of the morning written into official history. He did not particularly want to go, but he went because Gaines had kept every commitment he had made in that parking lot, and Caleb believed in honoring the people who kept their commitments. He parked in the department lot and was walking toward the entrance with Ranger when he heard his name. He turned. Derek Malloy was standing 15 feet away. He was in civilian clothes, not his uniform, which made him look both younger and more exposed in the way that authority worn too long made people look when it was removed. He had a coffee cup in his hand, and he was holding it with both hands, the way people held things when their hands needed something to do because the rest of them didn't know what to do. Caleb stopped walking. He waited. Malloy crossed the distance between them. He stopped about 4 feet away, the same distance he'd stood from Caleb in the diner 3 days ago, but with everything reversed, everything in him oriented differently. No authority in his posture, just a man. "I know you're here for the commendation," Malloy said. "I'm not here for anything official. He stopped, started again. "I found out where you were parking. I wanted to catch you before you went in. I wanted to say something that isn't for a camera or a record or a report." Caleb waited. "I went home that night," Malloy said. "The night after, and I sat in my kitchen and I watched the footage." He paused. "All of it. The footage of me putting the cuffs on you. The footage of Ranger sitting beside that bin alone." His jaw tightened. "And then I watched the bomb squad footage, the internal footage from their robot camera. What was in that bin?" He looked at Caleb directly. "I watched that, and I understood for the first time in a complete way what I had almost done, what I had almost allowed to happen because I decided I already knew what the situation was before I looked at it." He stopped. He was clearly working through something that was not finished working. "I've been a cop for 9 years," he said, "and I thought I was a good one. I thought the confidence I had was the kind of confidence that came from experience and training. And maybe some of it was, but some of it, he stopped again. Some of it was just arrogance wearing the costume of confidence. And I couldn't tell the difference because I had never been in a situation that required me to. He looked at Ranger. Your dog sat beside a trash bin in a room full of people losing their minds, and he did not move. He did not get distracted. He did not let the noise around him change what he knew. He looked back at Caleb. That's what it looks like when confidence comes from something real. I needed to see that. I needed to understand the difference. Caleb listened to all of it. He let it finish. Then he said, "What are you going to do with it?" Malloy looked at him. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I might not be a cop anymore after the investigation. I don't know. But whatever I do, I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to do it like there's always a possibility that the person in front of me knows something I don't. Like the information I need might be coming from a direction I didn't expect." He paused. "Like there might be a dog in the room who's already figured it out, and my job is to listen." Something in Caleb's chest moved. Not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness was a larger and more private thing than this moment required, but something like recognition. The recognition of a man trying to become something better than what he had demonstrated himself to be, which was its own kind of courage, different from the courage of combat, but not lesser. "Malloy," Caleb said. The man looked at him. "Get the training," Caleb said. "The military working dog recognition training. Chief Gaines committed to it departmentally, but do it yourself too, personally. Go to the handlers, go to the kennels. Learn what it looks like when a dog is doing what Ranger was doing. Make it something you carry." He paused. "And if you ever encounter another veteran in a situation like the one you encountered me, and remember that the dusty boots and the beard are not the story. The words coming out of their mouth are the story." Malloy nodded. His hands had settled on the coffee cup and stopped needing to grip it so hard. "I will," he said. "I give you my word." They looked at each other for a moment, two men across the distance of a morning that had changed them both in different ways, and then Caleb nodded once and turned and walked toward the entrance with Ranger at his side. He did not look back. He didn't need to. The commendation ceremony was brief and formal, and Caleb moved through it with the patience he brought to all formal things, standing straight and receiving the language of institutional recognition with genuine but quiet appreciation. Gaines spoke well. Harris spoke briefly and technically, and with the specific warmth of a professional honoring another professional's work. Thomas was present in the front row and caught Caleb's eye once with an expression that contained several things at once and required no translation. When it was over, Gaines shook Caleb's hand and then knelt down and shook Ranger's paw. Ranger permitted this with dignity. "There's something else," Gaines said, standing. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. "This came to the department this morning, addressed to Ranger specifically." He handed it to Caleb with the expression of a man who had read it already and was glad he had. Caleb unfolded it. It was a drawing, done in crayon with the particular bold, joyful inaccuracy of a 4-year-old's artwork. A large brown dog with enormous ears and a huge smile sitting beside a gray rectangle that Caleb understood was the trash bin, with stick figures standing around it in postures that somehow communicated relief and gratitude, even in the simplified language of crayon on paper. In the corner, in adult handwriting that belonged to Christine Aldous, were the words, "Emma wanted Ranger to have this. She says it's him saving everyone. She also says she's going to be a dog trainer when she grows up." Below the adult handwriting and the large, effortful letters of a child who was just learning how they worked. "Thank you, Ranger." Caleb stood in the hallway of the Clearwater Police Department and looked at the drawing for a long time. He did not trust himself to say anything, so he folded it carefully with the care he gave to things he intended to keep and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket close to his chest. He found Thomas in the parking lot afterward. The old Marine was leaning against his car with his arms crossed and the satisfied expression of a man at the end of a week that had been harder than most and better than most and would be carried for the rest of his life in the part of him where the things that mattered were kept. "How's the program call go?" Thomas asked. He had heard about Okafor through the particular network of veteran communication that moved faster than any formal system. "I'm going to Tampa next week," Caleb said. Thomas nodded approvingly. "Good. You should come," Caleb said. Thomas looked at him. "Me? You stood up in a diner when nobody else would," Caleb said. You recognize what right looks like when you see it. That's exactly the kind of person that program needs in the room. He looked at Thomas directly. Come to Tampa, see what they're doing. Tell me if it's real. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He looked at Ranger, who was sitting at Caleb's side with his characteristic patient readiness, present and available and undemanding. Then he looked back at Caleb. You know I'm 71 years old, Thomas said. I know, Caleb said, and you're asking me to get involved in something that sounds like it's going to require regular commitment and possibly travel, and definitely a lot of conversations with people who need things. Yes, Caleb said. Thomas looked at Ranger again. Ranger looked back at him with those dark, steady eyes. Carter had that same look, Thomas said quietly. That look that said, I know exactly what I'm here for, and I'm ready to do it. Yeah, Caleb said. A pause. Then Thomas uncrossed his arms and pushed off from the car. What time are we leaving Tuesday? Caleb almost smiled. 8 o'clock. I'll drive, Thomas said. Your truck looks like it's held together by memory and stubbornness. It is, Caleb said. It's gotten me everywhere I needed to go. They stood in the parking lot for a moment in the good, quiet way they had found with each other over the course of a week that neither of them had expected to end like this, standing in the afternoon sun with a commendation in one pocket and a 4-year-old's crayon drawing in the other and a plan for Tuesday. Thomas left first. Caleb stood by his truck for another minute, doing the thing he always did before getting in the pause, the breath, the quiet inventory of what was true. What was true was this. 7 days ago, he had been a man driving to a beach cabin with a retired military dog and no particular plan beyond quiet. He had stopped at a diner on impulse. His dog had found a bomb. A cop had put handcuffs on him. An old Marine had stood up. A bomb squad had come. A device had been neutralized. A federal agent had told him it was the third in a series. He had stood at a podium and said the thing that needed to be said. A woman in Mississippi had sent him an email about a yellow lab with a sideways ear. A 4-year-old named Emma had drawn him a picture in crayon. A program in Tampa was waiting for him on Tuesday. And a 23-year-old veteran was in federal custody, and the conversation about why that had happened and what could be done to prevent the next one was now finally loudly publicly happening in rooms where decisions were made. None of it was simple. None of it resolved cleanly into a lesson or a moral or a statement that could be put on a poster. Real things never did. Real things were complicated and interconnected and full of grief and grace in equal measure, and the only honest response to them was to stay present and keep doing the necessary thing. Caleb opened the truck door. Ranger jumped in the back. The engine turned over on the first try because the truck was held together by memory and stubbornness, and both of those had proved reliable. He pulled out of the parking lot. He turned south toward the beach. The road was clear and the afternoon was warm and the radio was off because he preferred the sound of the engine and the road in the particular silence that wasn't empty but full of everything that had accumulated in a week that had changed the shape of what came next. At a red light on the edge of town, he reached into his jacket and took out Emma's drawing. He looked at it one more time. The large-eared brown dog with the enormous smile sitting beside the gray rectangle, saving everyone. Thank you, Ranger. He put it back in his pocket. The light turned green. He drove. And somewhere in the back seat, Ranger breathed evenly in the afternoon light, a 78-pound animal who had done the one thing he knew how to do, in the one moment it was required, who had sat perfectly still beside a gray trash bin in a Florida diner while the world misread everything around him, who had held his truth with a discipline and a patience and a completeness that no amount of noise or confusion or human failure had been able to shake. He had not needed to be believed. He had only needed to be right. He had been right. When Caleb Walker finally pulled into the unpaved drive of the beach cabin and cut the engine and sat in the returning quiet of the place he had started from, he reached back and put his hand on Ranger's side and felt the slow, steady rise and fall of the dog's breathing. He felt the warmth of it. He felt the weight of the week settling into something he could carry, something that had a shape he could live with. He said very quietly the same 2 words he had said in the parking lot of Harbor Light Diner. After the bomb squad had done its work, after the handcuffs had come off, after 23 people had walked out of a building that was still standing because a monk had refused to move. Good boy. Ranger pressed his nose to Caleb's palm. Just once. Just briefly. Then he settled back and closed his eyes. Outside, the water kept doing what the water always did. endlessly, without complaint, practicing the same patience on every shore it touched. Some things, once they were built correctly, simply did not break. That was the whole truth of it, and it was enough.